Humans are mightier than you think. This is what happened next. My name is Vail Curran. I am a senior xenobiologist serving aboard the Hegemony Survey frigate Celestial Patience, and I have spent 41 years of my life studying other species. I have cataloged creatures that breathe acid. I have documented organisms that digest metal. I have logged the feeding patterns of a predator so fast that light itself barely catches up to it. In all of those 41 years, across every strange and terrible thing I have encountered in the dark between the stars, nothing, not a single creature, not a single moment, not a single discovery, prepared me for the humans. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what happened. I want you to understand that I am not a young researcher prone to exaggeration. I am not someone who scribbles dramatic conclusions into a field report after a single exciting afternoon. I have a reputation within the hegemony for being, as my colleagues generously put it, boring, methodical, careful. My previous supervisor once said that reading my reports was like watching stone cool. I took that as a compliment. So when I tell you that the humans changed everything, when I tell you that the moment their ship appeared on our long-range sensors was the moment the galaxy began a slow, irreversible shift towards something none of us were ready for, I need you to understand that I do not say it lightly. I say it because it is the most accurate scientific conclusion I have ever reached, and I say it because I was there. I watched it happen from the beginning, and the beginning was not what any of us expected. We were 3 standard weeks into a routine cataloging run along the outer edge of the contested corridor, a stretch of space that no major civilization had ever fully claimed, mostly because there was not much worth claiming there. Drifting rocks, thin nebulae, a few dead moons that smelled of sulfur when you cracked them open. My team had been collecting samples from a small asteroid cluster, a job so ordinary that I had assigned most of the cognitive work to automated probes, while I caught up on 11 months of unfinished literature reviews. I was deep in a particularly tedious paper on the bioluminescent communication patterns of the Veltari deep swimmers when the ship's alert system chimed softly, not the sharp, urgent tone that signals danger, the quiet, curious tone, the one that means something unusual has appeared, and it does not match any category in the database. I set down my reading and walked to the observation deck. Our sensor operator, a young hegemony technician named Queth, was leaning so far forward in his chair that he looked in danger of falling through the display entirely. His secondary eyes, the ones that only open when he is genuinely surprised, were fully extended. That alone told me something was wrong, because Queth had been on survey runs for 6 years, and I had never once seen his secondary eyes do anything other than doze. "What are we looking at?" I asked. Queth did not answer immediately. He was pulling data with both upper hands while his lower hands ran a verification sequence. His mouth made small, disbelieving shapes. Finally, without turning away from the display, he said, "Sir, something just came out of faster-than-light travel, approximately 900 kilometers off our port side." "Classification?" I said. "That is the problem," Queth said. "There is no classification. It does not match any vessel in the hegemony registry. It does not match any vessel in the Chorus archives. It does not match any vessel in the Dominion threat catalog. It does not match anything." I moved to the display. The object on screen was a ship, unmistakably a ship, but it looked like no ship I had ever seen in any database, live or archived. It was asymmetrical in a way that seemed almost intentional, as though someone had started with a design and then made 100 corrections over the course of decades, each correction done with whatever materials were available at the time. The hull was layered. Old plating sat beside new plating in patches of different color and texture, like a quilt made from scraps of metal. There were protrusions along the top third of the vessel that our sensor analysis could not immediately identify. They turned out, I would later learn, to be external docking clamps for small short-range craft, added to the original design as an afterthought. Much of the ship was, in fact, an afterthought, built on top of another afterthought. Our threat assessment system processed the vessel for about 4 seconds, and then returned a rating of minimal. I remember staring at that word, minimal. It sat in the corner of the display in calm blue lettering while I studied a ship that looked as though it had survived at least 3 major engagements, possibly more, and had been stitched back together each time by people who were more interested in getting back into the fight than in making the repairs look presentable. The minimal rating was based on the vessel's size. its apparent power output, and the fact that it had arrived alone. The assessment system was very good at calculating threats based on known parameters. What it could not calculate was the significance of that word alone. One ship, one single ship, emerging from faster-than-light travel in a stretch of space that should have been empty, with no escort, no support fleet, no backup of any visible kind. I would later come to understand that the humans often did things alone, not because they lacked numbers, but because one was sometimes enough, and they knew it, and they sent one anyway. Before I could say anything to Queth, the ship hailed us. It used our frequency, the correct frequency, the standard hegemony survey band. It used it cleanly, with no fumbling, no translation lag, no attempt at any of the 17 other communication protocols used by species operating in this region of space. Whoever was on that ship had done their homework. They knew exactly who we were and exactly how to reach us. The message was short. It said, "Hegemony Vessel Celestial Patience. This is Commander Nora Osei, of the independent starship Relentless. We are passing through, and mean no interference with your survey. We are available for communication, if you are interested. We like meeting new people." 3 things about that message stopped me cold. First, they knew our ship's name. Second, they used the phrase, independent starship, which meant they were not affiliated with any known government or authority, traveling without a flag. Third, and most significantly, they said they liked meeting new people. In all my years of deep space survey work, I had never once encountered a vessel that announced, as its opening communication, that it enjoyed contact with unknown species. Most civilizations at this stage of expansion were cautious, guarded. They sent formal identification, legal registry numbers, treaty references, requests for protocol compliance. They did not say they liked meeting new people as though they were attending a social gathering. I told Queth to open a return channel. I said, carefully, "Commander Osei, this is Senior Xenobiologist Vale Curran. We acknowledge your communication. May I ask the origin of your vessel? You are not listed in any registry we carry." There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. And then a voice came back, warm and clear, and carrying an energy that I could not immediately classify. "We are from a planet called Earth. You might not have it in your records yet. We have only been out here for about 60 years. We are still getting acquainted with the neighborhood." 60 years. That number hit me somewhere between the base of my skull and the top of my spine. 60 years of interstellar travel. The hegemony had been conducting deep space survey operations for over 900 years before we made first contact with another intelligent species. The chorus of aligned worlds took 3 centuries of space travel before they encountered their first neighbor. 60 years was nothing. 60 years was an eye blink. 60 years was the time it took most civilizations to figure out how to keep their early spacecraft from falling apart on re-entry. And yet here they were, 900 kilometers off our port side, having arrived in a ship that looked ancient and battle-worn, and completely unafraid, speaking our language, using our frequency, saying they liked meeting new people. "You have been in interstellar space for 60 years?" I said. "Give or take," Commander Osei said. There was something in her voice that I could not name yet, a kind of lightness, as though the conversation was pleasant rather than extraordinary. "We got a slow start, but we are making up for it." I turned to Queth. He was looking at me with the expression of someone who has just been told that the ground beneath them is not actually solid. I knew the feeling because I was having it too. I turned back to the display, looked at that patchwork ship hovering in space with its mismatched hull plates, and its external clamps, and its complete lack of any visible reason to be intimidating, and I said the only thing I could think to say. "Would you like to come aboard, or perhaps we could come to you?" There was another short pause. Then Commander Osei said, "Why don't you come to us? We just made coffee. Do you drink coffee?" I did not know what coffee was. I told her so. She said that was wonderful, because introducing new people to coffee was one of her favorite things. And she said it, I want to note, with genuine excitement, as though I had just told her something that made her day better, as though a senior xenobiologist confessing ignorance of a beverage was a gift. I assembled a small delegation, myself, Queth, our ship's diplomatic liaison Preth Vass, and one of our security officers, a large and reliably calm individual named Soth, who had the useful quality of not showing surprise on his face under almost any circumstances. We took one of our short-range transport vessels across the 900 kilometers of empty space between the Celestial Patience and the Relentless, and I spent that transit staring out the forward viewport at the human ship, growing larger in my field of view. Up close, it was even more extraordinary. The hull was marked in dozens of places, with evidence of old damage, not hidden or disguised, but simply repaired. Welded seams, fresh plating laid over older plating. In one section along the lower starboard side, the repair material was clearly a different alloy from the surrounding hull, a slightly warmer shade of gray-silver that caught the distant starlight differently. The whole ship wore its history on its surface. It had been damaged, and repaired, and damaged again, and repaired again, and at no point in that cycle had anyone apparently considered that perhaps it should be retired. Our transport matched airlocks with the Relentless, and we were met, on the other side of the boarding tube, by Commander Nora Osei herself. She was smaller than I expected. Most of the dominant species we had encountered in this region of space were physically imposing, which made a certain evolutionary sense. Size and strength tended to be survival advantages on a wide variety of worlds. Commander Osei stood perhaps half a head shorter than Preth Vass, who was himself below average height for a hegemony diplomat. She had dark brown skin and close-cut hair, and eyes that were so dark they were nearly black. She wore a uniform that was simple and practical, a deep navy blue, with nothing on it that was not functional. No decorative elements, no rank markings that I could interpret yet, though I later learned the small silver pin near her collar indicated her command status. She was smiling, a wide, open expression that showed the flat, hard teeth humans use for grinding food. Our cultural database, which I had consulted during the short transit, identified this expression as a gesture of social submission, a display of harmlessness, an offer of non-aggression. When a human showed their teeth in this particular configuration, our records said, it meant they acknowledged your authority and intended no threat. I believed that for about 4 days. I will tell you when I stopped believing it. She reached out and extended one hand, fingers open, palm slightly tilted upward. Our database said this was a greeting ritual, a physical acknowledgement of first contact, a gesture of open-handedness, indicating that the hand held no weapon. I extended my own hand, in what I hoped was an appropriate mimicry of the gesture, and she gripped it briefly, firmly, and shook it twice. "Xenobiologist Vile Kurin," she said. "Welcome aboard the Relentless. I am very glad to meet you." "Commander Osei," I said. "The feeling is mutual. This is an unexpected encounter." "The best ones always are," she said, and she turned and led us into the ship. The interior of the Relentless was the second thing that surprised me, after the ship's exterior. The Hegemony's survey vessels are designed for efficiency, clean lines, rational use of space, colors kept to a neutral palette to minimize cognitive interference with instruments. The corridors of the Celestial Patience could have been drawn with a ruler and a logic processor. They were exactly as wide as they needed to be, and no wider. They were lit at exactly the wavelength most useful for hegemony biology. They were, in a word, correct. The interior of the Relentless was not correct. It was something else entirely. The corridors were slightly too wide, slightly too tall, in a way that felt generous rather than wasteful. The walls were covered, not with instrument panels and status displays, though those were present, but with other things as well. Drawings, photographs rendered onto flat surfaces and attached to the wall with small adhesive squares, a rough, colorful cloth banner that was clearly handmade, stretched across the entrance to what I would later learn was the ship's main gathering area. Written on it, in 4 different colors, in the uneven hand of someone who had made it without professional tools, were the words, "Home is where the crew is." The smell hit me as we moved deeper into the ship, something warm and dark and bitter that I had no reference for, with a faint sweetness underneath it. Coffee, I would soon discover. The smell of it was everywhere, threaded through the air recycling system, embedded in the walls, a permanent feature of the ship's atmosphere so thorough that I suspected it had been there for years. We were brought to a large central room. 8 humans were already there, and they stood when Commander Osei entered, not in a stiff military fashion, but in the easy, instinctive way of people who respect someone genuinely. She waved them back down with one hand and gestured for us to sit. Chairs had been arranged, including two that had been modified, that day from the look of it, to accommodate bodies shaped differently from a human body. Someone had taken the time to research hegemony physiology and retrofit seating accordingly. For visitors they had not known they would be receiving until an hour ago. Queth leaned toward me as we sat and said, very quietly, in our own language, "They modified the chairs." "I noticed," I said. "They did it fast," he said. "I noticed that too," I said. A young human male moved through the room with ceramic containers, filling them from a large metal vessel that had clearly seen significant use. He set one in front of each of us and said, in careful, accented hegemony standard, "Please do not feel any pressure to drink it. We know it might not suit your biology. Commander Osei just wanted you to have the option." That was a small thing. One sentence from a young crew member handing out cups. But I want you to notice it, because it was exactly what the whole ship was like. Thoughtful. Precise. Not in a calculating way, not in a diplomatic way, but in the way of people who have genuinely considered what the person across from them might need, and then done it without being asked. Our security officer Soth, who I mentioned does not show surprise on his face, was looking at his coffee cup with an expression that I had to classify as wonder. He was not a wonder-prone individual. He was very good at his job precisely because wonder was mostly unavailable to him. And yet, Commander Osei sat across from me, both hands wrapped around her own cup, and she said, "So, tell me about the hegemony. We have heard a little. We would like to hear more from someone who actually lives it." And that was how it began. Not with a threat assessment, not with a territorial dispute or a trade negotiation, or any of the usual machinery of first contact between civilizations that have claims to protect. It began with a question, a genuine, interested, curious question, from a human commander sitting in a repaired ship with mismatched hull plates and chairs modified for strangers, asking me to tell her about my home. I talked for 3 hours. She listened the entire time. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that told me she was not just being polite, but actually thinking about the answers. Twice she asked crew members to look up specific information she wanted to compare against something I had said. Once, when I mentioned a particular aspect of hegemony governance that I thought might be controversial, she simply nodded and said, "That's interesting. I don't know if we would do it that way, but I understand why you did." Not, "That is wrong." Not, "That is backward." Not the polite, careful silence of a diplomat storing information for later use. Just, "I understand why you did." At one point I asked, carefully, how their vessel had come to look the way it did. The repairs, the patches, the layering of old and new. She looked around the room for a moment, as though seeing it freshly through my eyes, and then she said, "We have had a rough few decades. Some of it was our own fault, some of it was not. But we kept going. The ship kept going. We fix what breaks, and we keep going." Fix what breaks and keep going. I wrote that phrase in my field notes that evening. I wrote it in the margin without any context or analysis, which I never do. I write complete sentences in my field notes. I note sources and dates and confidence levels. I do not write fragments in margins. But I wrote that one, because something about it struck me as important in a way I could not yet fully articulate. Before we left, we stayed 4 hours in total, which was longer than I had planned. Commander Osei asked if she could send us a copy of a document. She called it a brief overview of human history, though she said that brief was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because human history was not brief by any honest measure. She said it might be useful background if we were going to be reporting on the contact, which she assumed we would be. We would be reporting on the contact. That was an understatement so large it was almost funny in hindsight. I would be filing reports on this contact for the next 14 months. The Hegemony Council would spend weeks reading those reports. The Chorus of Aligned Worlds would request copies. The Dominion Intelligence Service would eventually obtain copies by methods I prefer not to think about. But all of that was still ahead of us as we climbed back into our transport vessel and crossed the 900 kilometers of empty space back to the celestial patients. Queth was quiet for most of the crossing, which was unusual for him. Soth was also quiet, which was not unusual, but the quality of his quiet was different. He was looking out the viewport at the shrinking shape of the Relentless, with an expression that was, I thought, the closest he had come to troubled in all the years I had known him. I was looking at my field notes. I had filled more pages in 4 hours than I usually filled in a week of survey work. Not because the humans had said anything shocking, not yet, but because nearly everything they said required notation. Nearly everything required, check this, verify this, cross-reference this with known data, find out why this does not match what the database says. The database said the smile was a submission gesture. The database said the open palm handshake meant they acknowledged our authority. The database said 60 years of interstellar travel indicated an early-stage civilization, likely cautious, likely deferential, likely uncertain of its place in the larger galactic community. The database was wrong, not in a small way, not in the way a database is wrong when it has a fact slightly off, or a date slightly misremembered. The database was wrong in the way a map is wrong, when it shows you a road where there is actually a mountain. I did not know the full extent of it yet. I was still telling myself that the humans were interesting, unusual, a fascinating subject of study. I was still telling myself that my reaction to them was professional curiosity, the normal excitement of encountering a new species. But I kept coming back to one thing. One moment during those 4 hours that I could not file neatly into any category. Near the end of our visit, one of the crew members had come to the doorway of the gathering room and said something to Commander Ose in a low voice. I did not catch the words. She had listened, nodded once, and said something back that I also did not catch. And then she had turned back to me, and the conversation had continued without interruption. Later, reviewing my notes, I asked Queth if his audio capture had picked up the exchange. He checked. It had. The crew member had said that one of the ship's secondary power conduits had developed a fault and was currently operating at reduced efficiency. Commander Ose had said, "How reduced?" The crew member had said, "About 30%. Commander Ose had said, "Good enough. Fix it when you have time. Nothing urgent." 30% reduction in power output on a ship that was already operating with visible hull damage from previous engagements. In a region of space where they had no backup, no support, no allied vessel within any reasonable response distance. And her response was, "Fix it when you have time. Nothing urgent." Not, "How serious is this?" Not, "Do we need to withdraw?" Not, "What is our contingency if it worsens?" Just, "Nothing urgent," because to her, apparently, it was not. That was when I first started to suspect that our threat assessment system's rating of minimal had been not just wrong, but wrong in a direction that was the opposite of the truth. I submitted my initial contact report that night. In the summary field, where I typically wrote one sentence, I wrote 3. The last one said, "Recommend sustained observation and study. Humans are not what they appear to be. I do not yet know what they are, but I intend to find out." That intention, as it turned out, would define the next 14 months of my life, and I will tell you now, without any dramatic qualification, that it was the most important work I have ever done. Not because the humans were dangerous, not because they were a threat in any of the ways the hegemony had been trained to recognize threats, but because understanding them, truly understanding them, meant understanding something the hegemony had been wrong about for 900 years of expansion across the stars. Something we had been measuring wrong, something we had been classifying wrong, something that, once you saw it clearly, made you look back at everything you thought you knew, and realize that the map had always shown a road where there was actually a mountain. I drank the coffee before I left. She had been right. It was extraordinary. The next morning, the Relentless was still there when I checked the sensors. I had half expected it to be gone, the way remarkable things sometimes vanish when you try to look at them directly. But it was still there, 900 kilometers off our port side, going about whatever business a human ship went about in the early morning of a regular day. I poured myself a cup of our standard morning beverage, a pale, thin liquid that the hegemony considered perfectly adequate, and I thought about the word adequate. I thought about it for a long time, and then I opened my field notes and started a new page. The page was titled, simply, "What I Am Missing." It turned out to be the longest document I had ever written. My second day of observation aboard the Celestial Patience, watching the Relentless on long-range sensors, taught me the first of many lessons I would need to unlearn from my training. Movement around the human ship was constant. Their short-range craft cycled in and out at irregular intervals. Their crew worked in rotations that my analysis suggested were not efficiently optimized for maximum rest. There were too many people awake at what should have been rest periods, too many lights on in sections that should have been dark. At first, I attributed this to poor operational discipline. Later, I would understand that it was something else. Humans, I came to learn, did not always sleep when they were supposed to. Some of them barely slept at all, by choice, because there was something they wanted to finish, or someone they wanted to talk to, or a problem they could not let rest until they had turned it over one more time in their minds. They ran on something other than optimized rest cycles. They ran on momentum, and the momentum of even one human was a remarkable thing to watch. Commander Ose sent another message that second morning. She said she had been thinking about something I had mentioned about hegemony survey methodology, and had a question, if I did not mind. She had a question about my work. She had listened to 3 hours of conversation about hegemony science and governance and culture, and she had retained enough of it overnight to have a follow-up question. I sent back an answer. She sent back another question. This continued for most of the morning. By midday, I had answered 11 questions, each one building on the last, and I realized that I was being interviewed, not in a formal or pressured way, but in the way a genuinely curious person conducts an interview, when they are trying to understand something fully, and they will keep asking until they do. Queth brought me lunch at my station and set it down without comment. He looked at the communication log on my screen, and then looked at me and said, "She has been awake since before our sensors came back online this morning." "How do you know?" I said. "Because," he said, "her messages have been consistent in tone and speed since before our first light. No variation, no slowing down, no morning grogginess. She just started transmitting, and has not stopped." I looked at the timestamps. He was right. Commander Nora Ose had been responding to messages since approximately 4 hours before the standard human rest period should have ended, assuming their rest cycles followed anything close to the standard biological parameters we had estimated. Either she did not sleep, or she had slept for a very short time, or she had gotten up hours early, because she had more questions, and she did not want to wait. Fix what breaks, and keep going. I added a new note to my field document. It said, "They do not wait. Not impatiently. Not with frustration. They simply do not wait. Because waiting means not doing. And not doing, for a human, appears to be a state of some discomfort." I would learn, in the weeks that followed, how right that was. I would learn how many different forms that truth took. I would learn that it applied to physical danger, and to scientific problems, and to grief, and to love, and to the particular human habit of deciding that a thing was wrong, and then working, without rest, until it was right. But on that second morning, I only knew that a human commander had been awake for what should have been most of her sleep cycle, because she had things she wanted to know, and I thought, that is curious, and I was wrong. It was not curious. It was the beginning of everything. The Relentless did not leave our sensor range for 11 days. In those 11 days, Commander Ose and I exchanged 412 messages. Her crew performed 2 external hull inspections, during which 2 of her engineers spent 3 hours in the vacuum of space making adjustments to equipment on the outside of the ship. They wore suits, of course, but the suits were not heavy armored equipment. They were relatively light, flexible, designed for movement rather than protection. The engineers moved along the outside of the ship with the ease of people doing familiar work, talking to each other on an open channel that I could hear, occasionally laughing at things I could not understand, because the humor required cultural context I had not yet acquired. On the 3rd day, I asked Commander Ose if I could come back aboard, not for a diplomatic visit, simply to observe, to watch her crew work and ask questions. She said yes, before I finished the sentence. She said, "Come whenever you want. The coffee is always on." I went back 4 times in those 11 days. Each time I learned something that required me to revise a previous assumption. Each time I left with more questions than I had arrived with. Each time, Soth accompanied me, and each time, his expression of contained wonder grew slightly less contained. On the last day, before the Relentless prepared to leave, Commander Ose found me in the ship's small library. They had a library, a physical one, with actual objects that contained printed information, which I had been examining with considerable fascination, and she said, "Vale Curran, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to know you can answer directly back." "Of course," I said. "What does the hegemony think of us?" she said. "Not the official position. What do the people who actually look at the data think? I considered the question for a moment. Then I said, I think the people who have seen the data are still deciding, and I think the people who have not seen the data think you are a minor species in the early stages of development. Interesting, but not yet significant. She nodded. She looked like she had expected that answer. And what do you think? She said. I looked at her, small, dark-eyed, wearing her plain navy uniform with its single silver pin, standing in a library full of physical books, on a ship that had been repaired so many times it wore the history of its own survival on its hull, having been awake, as far as I could tell, for most of the last 11 days. I said, I think the people who have not seen the data are making a significant error. She smiled, that wide, open, tooth-showing smile that our database called a submission gesture, standing there in the library of her battered, remarkable ship, with 412 messages between us and 11 days of watching her crew move through danger like it was Tuesday. She smiled at me. And for the first time, I thought, that smile is not submission. That smile is something else. That smile is the expression of someone who has already calculated how this is going to go, and found the calculation interesting. I just did not know yet what the calculation was, but I was starting to understand that I needed to find out, because the hegemony was operating on a map that showed a road, and ahead of us, whether we could see it or not, there was a mountain, and the humans had already been climbing it for 60 years. I sent my second report to the Hegemony Council that evening. The subject line was, Revised Assessment of Human Civilization. In the body of the report, I wrote 12 pages of careful, methodical, boring analysis. In the final paragraph I wrote, Our initial assessment was substantially incorrect. I recommend an immediate upgrade of status classification from early stage minor to active significant. I also recommend, respectfully but firmly, that we do not attempt to define this species by comparison to anything we have previously encountered. They are not a slower version of us. They are not a smaller version of anything. They are themselves, entirely, and I am not certain we have the vocabulary yet to describe what that means. I am going to keep looking. I will report when I know more. The Council's response arrived 6 days later. It said, Acknowledged. Continue observation. If they had read my report properly, if any of them had understood what I was trying to tell them, they might have said something else. They might have started preparing. They might have had more questions of their own, the way Commander Ose always had more questions, the way humans always had more questions, because they were people who did not accept that they understood something until they had turned it over one more time and looked at the underside. But the Council said, Acknowledged. Continue observation. So I did. I continued observing, and what I observed next made everything before it look like a warm-up. They called it a hard stop. That was the human term for arriving the way the Relentless had arrived, dropping out of faster-than-light travel without the standard deceleration buffer that every known spacefaring civilization used to protect their crew from the physical strain of transition. Every other species had developed the buffer independently, through long and painful experience, because the alternative was severe neurological damage to anyone aboard. The deceleration buffer existed because the physics of FTL transition, if not managed carefully, did things to biological tissue that no one wanted to think about at length. Humans had figured this out early in their spacefaring history. Then they had figured out how to do it safely. Then, apparently, some of them had decided to skip the safety part when the situation called for speed, or when the arrival needed to make an impression, or, as Commander Ose had explained to me in one of our 400 messages, when the crew could use a morale boost. A morale boost. They performed a physically dangerous FTL maneuver to give their crew a morale boost. I had written that fact down in my notes 3 times in 3 different places, because I was afraid that if I only wrote it once, I would later assume I had misunderstood. I had not misunderstood. I asked Ose to explain it again on my second visit aboard the Relentless, and she explained it the same way. It helps, she said simply. Coming in hard and fast says something. It says we are not afraid, and we know what we are doing. The crew feels that. It matters. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about the idea of choosing to do a difficult and dangerous thing, not because it was the only option, but because of what it communicated. Not to an enemy, to your own people. About the relationship between a commander and her crew, that made that choice not just possible but useful. Hegemony Command Doctrine had 17 protocols for maintaining crew morale. They involved rest schedules, nutrition optimization, stress reduction environments, psychological monitoring, and regular formal acknowledgement of performance. Every one of those protocols had been developed over centuries, refined and tested and peer-reviewed. They were good protocols. They worked. None of them involved doing something dangerous on purpose to let the crew feel what it was like to arrive somewhere like you owned the space between the stars. I noted this contrast in my field documents and moved on, because there was so much else to note, but I came back to it later, again and again, because I think it was one of the first real clues about what humans actually were, beneath the surface of all the specific behaviors I was cataloging. They were people who understood, in a way that seemed almost biological, that some truths could only be communicated through action, that some things had to be felt rather than told. That was not a small difference. That was not a cultural preference or an interesting quirk. That was something structural, something deep, and I was still working out its full implications when the situation at Ketharon forced me to stop working out implications and start writing emergency reports instead. But I am getting ahead of myself. Between the relentless departing our sensor range and Ketharon, there was the matter of being invited aboard. 3 weeks after the Relentless left, I received a formal communication from Commander Osei. She had discussed with her crew the possibility of hosting a longer-term exchange observer, someone who would travel with them for a period, learn about human ship operations from the inside, and in turn share information about the hegemony and other civilizations the Relentless had not yet encountered. She wanted to offer that position to me, if the hegemony would permit it, and if I was willing. I sent my request for authorization to the Council that same day. The Council deliberated for 9 days, and then approved it, with conditions. I was to file weekly reports. I was to maintain observer status only and not participate in any operational decision-making. I was to report any aggressive actions or treaty violations immediately. I was to remember, at all times, that I was a representative of hegemony interests. I agreed to all of this, packed what I needed, arranged for Queth to continue the survey work in my absence, and said goodbye to Soth, who looked at me with an expression I later realized was something close to envy. The Relentless came back for me 6 days later, executing what Osei's pilot called a casual pickup, but which involved a transit speed and docking approach that made the Celestial Patience's crew visibly uncomfortable. A crew member named Kofi met me at the airlock. He was a large man with a wide smile and hands that looked as though they had been doing difficult work for a long time. He took my bag from me, both bags, one in each hand, and said, "Welcome aboard permanently. I am Kofi. I fix things. If something breaks near you, I will fix it. If nothing breaks, I will probably still be around because something usually breaks eventually." This turned out to be entirely accurate. The room I was given was small but thoughtfully arranged. Someone had consulted the data I had sent about hegemony physiology and made adjustments to the light spectrum and the temperature. There was a small table with a chair modified to fit my body. On the table was a ceramic cup and a small card that said, in careful handwriting, "The coffee machine is on the right when you leave your door. 2 doors down on the left is Kofi's workshop if you need anything. And welcome." The welcome had 3 small drawn marks after it that I eventually learned to recognize as a human expression of warmth transferred to paper. 3 tiny drawings of a curved line, which is apparently what humans draw when they want to indicate that something is smiling. I stood in my room for a moment, holding that small card, and I thought, they made this. Someone on this crew, before I arrived, sat down and made this card by hand, and drew those 3 small marks on it, and put it on my table, so that the first thing I saw when I settled in was a message of welcome that could not have been generated by any automated system because it was too personal and too small and too exactly what was needed. I have kept that card. It is in my desk in my home office on Hegemony Central, between 2 pieces of clear preservation material. It is the single smallest piece of evidence I collected in 14 months of the most important work of my life, and I think it might also be the most significant. My first full week aboard the Relentless was, by any objective measure, overwhelming. Not in a negative way, in the way that being immersed in a very cold but clean river is overwhelming, immediate, bracing, impossible to ignore, and somehow clarifying rather than obscuring. I followed a different crew member each day. with their permission and with Osei's encouragement, and I asked questions, and they answered, and sometimes they asked me questions in return, and I answered those too. And by the end of the week I had enough material for a report that would have taken me 3 months to write properly. I did not write it properly. I wrote rough notes and promised myself I would come back to them. Some of those rough notes I am still processing. The crew of the Relentless numbered 43 people at the time of my arrival. They were diverse in a way that I initially catalogued as unusual, before I came to understand that it was, for humans, entirely normal. They came from many different parts of a planet, with many different cultures and languages and historical backgrounds, and they had chosen to be in this ship together, in this particular cold, dark corner of space, doing a job that was by any standard difficult and occasionally extremely dangerous. And they were, for the most part, extraordinarily good at it. There was Kofi, who I have mentioned, whose formal title was Chief Engineer, and whose practical role was closer to the ship's circulatory system. He kept everything flowing, kept everything functional, seemed to exist in every part of the ship simultaneously, and had the quality of someone who never panicked because he had already imagined every possible failure scenario and had a response prepared. He was also the crew member most likely to be found in the middle of the night sitting with someone who was having a hard time, not because it was his job, but because he noticed and he stayed. There was the ship's navigator, a tall woman named Priya who had a gift for spatial reasoning so acute that she could calculate transit routes in her head that other navigators needed 30 minutes of computer processing to confirm. She was also the crew's unofficial historian and could tell you the origin story of any piece of equipment on the ship, any repair that had ever been made, any mission they had ever run, with the detail and timing of someone who had been there for all of it. She had. She was one of the 3 crew members who had been with the Relentless from its first flight. There was the weapons officer, a quiet man named Darian, who spoke very little but read constantly. I never once saw him without a book or a display in his hands during off-duty hours. He read things entirely unrelated to his job, histories, philosophy, dense scientific papers in fields that had nothing to do with spacecraft weaponry. When I asked him why, he said, "Because I like understanding how things work, all kinds of things." I noted that he said all kinds of things, with a specific emphasis that made me think he meant living things as much as mechanical ones. Later events confirmed this interpretation. There was the ship's doctor, a woman named Linda, who had been treating injuries from situations that would have retired any hegemony medical officer for the past 12 years, without apparent diminishment of her energy or her humor. She had a habit of telling jokes at moments of peak tension that I initially found baffling, and later came to understand as a kind of controlled pressure release, a way of briefly reducing the weight of a difficult situation by acknowledging its absurdity. She was also, I eventually realized, extraordinarily precise in her work. Her humor was not a distraction from her competence. It was concurrent with it. These were the humans I lived alongside for the next months. 43 individuals, each one a study in contradiction by hegemony standards, capable of enormous warmth and equally enormous capability, frightening in competence but disarming in manner, carrying histories of damage that would have defined most species, and instead having integrated that damage into something that looked, from the outside, almost like fuel. The moment that changed my understanding most completely came on a Tuesday, as it happened. A real Tuesday, by human reckoning, in the 3rd week of my time aboard. Kofi had been scheduled to perform a routine external inspection of a sensor array on the aft section of the hull. This was a standard task, done on a regular cycle, requiring approximately 2 hours of work in a suit in close proximity to the hull. I had asked permission to watch via the external cameras, which was granted. I had set up my recording equipment and settled in at a monitoring station, expecting to document a routine maintenance operation. What happened instead was that during Kofi's inspection, the ship moved through a patch of uncharted microparticle debris, not dangerous to the ship, but dense enough to require a pressure adjustment to his suit's exterior membrane while he was still outside. The adjustment was standard procedure. The suit handled it. Kofi continued working, but the debris also revealed a crack in the sensor housing that had not shown up on internal diagnostics. A crack that, if left unaddressed, would have allowed gradual atmosphere seep into the sensor array and caused a failure within approximately 3 weeks. So Kofi fixed it, while he was outside, in the suit, in the microparticle debris. which was still moving around him like a very fine, slow rain. He had not brought the specific tool he would need for that repair, because he had not known he would need it, so he improvised. He used a secondary tool in a way it was not precisely designed to be used, applied a sealant from a secondary kit, and spent 40 minutes completing a repair he had not planned, had not prepared for, and did not once express any particular distress about. He was humming. I could hear it on the audio feed. A low, tuneless, very quiet hum, the sound of someone doing satisfying work. When he came back inside, I met him at the airlock and asked how he felt. He set down his kit, pulled off his gloves and said, "Good. Found something that needed fixing. Fixed it. Good day." He paused. "Did you eat yet? There is food." I had to sit down after that, not because I was distressed, because I needed a moment to reconcile what I had just observed with every biological and psychological model I had for how organisms respond to unexpected risk in isolated environments. The model said, elevated stress hormones, increased heart rate, behavioral caution, heightened threat assessment, possible withdrawal from the task. The model said, 40 minutes of unplanned difficult work at close range to a structural fault, in a suit, in debris, while monitoring multiple variables without assistance, should produce measurable stress responses. Kofi had come in and asked if I had eaten yet. I added a new entry to my field document. It was longer than usual. It was also less organized than usual, because my thoughts were moving faster than my standard note-taking discipline could keep up with. The gist of it was this. I had been studying human resilience as a behavioral trait, something they had developed and maintained through experience. But watching Kofi, I was beginning to wonder if it was something closer to biological, something in their architecture, a baseline, not the absence of fear, but a relationship with fear that was fundamentally different from anything I had encountered in any other species. I brought this question to Commander Osei that evening. I sat in her small office, which was also her dining area, because the ship was not large enough for the captain to have 2 separate rooms, and I asked her directly, "Do humans feel fear the way other species do?" She thought about it for a real moment. She was not the kind of person who answered important questions quickly. "We feel it," she said. "Absolutely. Fear is real for us. But I think the difference is that we feel it, and then we do the thing anyway. We have a word for that. We call it courage. But I think for most of my crew it is not even courage anymore. It has just become the pattern. You feel the fear, you assess it, you decide if it is worth stopping for, and usually you decide it is not. And then you go fix the sensor housing." I wrote that down word for word. Then I wrote, beneath it, "They have domesticated fear, not eliminated it, not suppressed it, made it useful, made it a data point rather than a destination. For most species, fear is an endpoint. It says stop, it says back away, it says this is where the boundary of the possible is. For humans, fear appears to be a waypoint, a check-in, something you pass through on the way to the thing that needs doing." I filed my 3rd report to the council that week. The subject line was, "Critical Revision of Threat Classification." In the body, I wrote 20 pages. At the end, I wrote, "I want to be precise about what I mean when I say these are not like other species. I do not mean they are more aggressive. I do not mean they are more warlike. I mean they are more capable than they appear, in ways that are not visible in standard assessment metrics. Our metrics measure what a species can do. They do not measure what a species is willing to endure in order to do it. Humans are willing to endure quite a lot. I am not yet certain of the upper limit. I am not certain there is one." The council filed my report under ongoing observation. They did not reply. 8 days later, something happened in the engineering section that I want to describe carefully because I think it illustrates what I was trying to tell the council more clearly than 20 pages of analysis ever could. One of the secondary power conduits that had been running at reduced efficiency, the one I had overheard Osei discussing on my first visit, developed a more serious fault. Not critical, not immediately dangerous, but significant enough that the ship's automated systems flagged it at the highest maintenance priority. Kofi was already in the middle of 2 other repairs. The ship's 2nd engineer, a young woman named B who had been with the crew for less than 2 years, took the conduit repair herself. B was 23 years old by human reckoning. She had been in space for 22 months. She had very specific experience with propulsion systems, and almost none with power conduit architecture of this particular generation. I know this because I checked her personnel file afterward. She spent 4 hours in the conduit access channel, which was approximately 60 centimeters wide, and required her to work lying on her side for most of that time, in a space where the ambient temperature ran at about 38 degrees standard Celsius due to the heat from the surrounding systems. She emerged at the end of those 4 hours with the conduit running at 97% efficiency, having essentially taught herself the repair through a combination of the ship's technical library, advice relayed from Kofi, who was still working on the other fault 3 sections away, and what I can only describe as reasonable inference about how things probably fit together when she could not find the specific information she needed. She came out of the access channel, stood up, stretched her back, and said to the nearest crew member, "Conduit is done. Any food left?" I had been watching on the monitoring feed. I watched her stand up. I watched the stretch. The completely normal, unremarkable, end-of-a-task stretch of someone who had finished a job and was ready for the next thing. 4 hours in a 60-centimeter channel at 38 degrees, self-teaching a repair outside her specialty, and she stood up and asked about food. I thought about the hegemony survey mission protocols for repair operations, the mandatory recovery period after extended maintenance work in elevated temperature environments, the compulsory physiological monitoring, the rest requirements, the documentation that had to be filed before and after. All of those protocols existed for good reasons. They existed because most species needed them, because most species had limits that the protocols were designed to protect. I was beginning to think that when it came to humans, the protocols would need to be completely rewritten, not because the humans were beyond limits, but because their limits were somewhere so much further out than anything the protocols assumed, that the protocols themselves became almost meaningless in this context. That evening, the off-duty crew gathered in the main room for what they called game night. Cards, dice, a board game that Priya had been carrying since before the ship's first flight. Bia was there, 20 minutes after emerging from 4 hours in a conduit channel, laughing at something Darian had said about the game rules. Kofi was there, still in his work clothes, having finished his 3rd repair of the day an hour ago. Commander Ose was there, sitting with her feet up on a spare chair, losing at cards with apparent enjoyment. I was invited. I sat at the edge of the group and watched them play and talk and argue cheerfully about the rules of games I did not understand, and I thought about what I was watching. 43 people in a damaged ship in an empty corner of space, doing difficult and sometimes dangerous work, and in the middle of it, they played games. They told jokes. They fed each other. They sat together in a room that smelled of coffee, and made noise that was, unmistakably, the noise of people who were glad to be where they were. I did not understand it fully yet. I did not have the framework for it, but I knew that it mattered. I knew that whatever this was, this strange particular resilience, this stubborn insistence on warmth in cold places, it was connected to everything else I had observed. The hard stop arrival, and the modified chairs, and the handmade card, and Kofi asking if I had eaten. It was all the same thing, all one piece. I just needed to find the word for it. I was still looking for that word when the Ketharon situation began, and by the time it ended, I no longer needed a word. I needed a new language entirely. Commander Ose received a signal on the 5th week of my time aboard. She was in her office when it came, and I was sitting at a monitoring station in the adjacent room, working through my notes from the previous day, when I heard her voice change. Not dramatically, not to an alarm, just change. The way a person's voice changes when they have received information that requires the part of their mind that plans to immediately activate. She came to the doorway and said, "Vale Curran, I need to give you some information, and I need you to understand that what I am about to do is not a hegemony operation, and you are under no obligation to support it or endorse it." I put down my notes. "What has happened?" I said. 40,000 non-combatants are moving through the Ketharon corridor in a civilian convoy, she said. The Vorkai Dominion has mobilized a fleet, and they are heading for that corridor. The convoy has no military escort. The hegemony will be informed, I said. Diplomatic channels. There is no time for diplomatic channels, she said. She was not angry when she said it. She was very calm. We are 6 hours from the corridor at hard stop. The Dominion fleet will be there in 7. I understood what she was saying before she said the rest of it. I understood it from the math, and from the way her face looked, and from 5 weeks of watching this woman exist in this ship. But she said it anyway, because she was the kind of person who said things plainly. "I am going," she said. "1 hour to departure. You are welcome to stay aboard, or I can arrange a transfer back to the celestial patients. Your choice. Your timeline." She went to find Priya, to start calculating the route. I sat at my monitoring station for approximately 45 seconds. Then I sent a message to the Hegemony Council, notifying them of the situation and my intended location. Then I stayed at my station, because there was no version of this I was willing to observe from a distance. I have filed many reports in my life. I have described many things. I am going to describe what happened at Ketharan as precisely as I can, because precision is what I have to offer, and because what happened there deserves precision. Not drama, precision. The Relentless arrived at the corridor entrance 2 minutes before the Dominion fleet. Those 2 minutes, I later understood, were the point. Not to arrive early enough to set up a defensive position or calculate optimal angles. 2 minutes before was the point, because it gave Osei exactly enough time to do one thing. She opened a channel to the Dominion fleet on all available frequencies and said, in Dominion Standard. She spoke it without any translation lag, she had clearly prepared. "This is Commander Nora Osei of the Relentless. You have one chance to turn around. I recommend you take it." 37 ships. The Dominion fleet numbered 37 warships, each one larger than the Relentless by a significant margin, each one part of a military apparatus that had never been stopped in 6 documented campaigns across this region of space. 37 ships looking at one human vessel that was, as their assessment systems certainly calculated, minimal. They did not turn around. I will not describe the battle at length, not because I did not observe it in detail. I observed it in extraordinary detail, and my technical report on the engagement runs to 63 pages, but because describing it only in technical terms feels wrong, and describing it in dramatic terms feels dishonest. What I will say is this. The Relentless fought for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Darian, who read philosophy and history in his off-duty hours, and spoke very little, demonstrated a level of tactical creativity that I had no reference point for. Priya calculated and recalculated transit paths in real time, threading the Relentless through gaps in the Dominion formation that should not have been large enough to matter, and somehow were. Kofi rerouted power 3 times during the engagement, each time in response to damage that was already happening, each rerouting maintaining functionality that the damage should have ended. Bay, in the engineering channel, held systems together with a combination of skill and what I could only describe as a refusal to let them fail. And Commander Osei stood at the center of all of it and said, clearly and quietly, exactly what she needed to say, and nothing more. Not commands that needed explanation, not orders that required justification. Just, do this, go here, now this, now that. And her crew did, because they had trained for this, because they had run it in their minds 100 times in 100 different forms. Because when the moment came, the fear, and there was fear, I saw it on faces, I heard it in a voice or two, was a waypoint, not a destination. They passed through it, and kept working. When it ended, the corridor was clear. The convoy was safe. The Relentless had taken significant damage to 3 sections, one of which would require repair work that Kofi was already assessing before the last Dominion ship had left sensor range. Commander Osei opened a channel to the convoy. "This is Commander Osei. The route is clear. You are safe to proceed. Is everyone all right?" Is everyone all right? After 11 minutes of the most intense tactical engagement I had ever personally witnessed, in close proximity to events that should have been physically impossible for a single vessel of that class, her first words to the people she had just protected were a question about their well-being. The convoy lead confirmed. All 40,000 individuals aboard, safe. All vessels intact, no casualties. Osei closed the channel. She sat down in the captain's chair for the first time in 11 minutes. She looked at the damage reports Kofi was already sending to her screen. She looked at them for about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Kofi, what do you need?" Not, "We won." Not, "Assess the victory." "What do you need?" I excused myself. I told the crew I needed to review my recording data. What I actually needed was to stand in my room for 10 minutes and process what I had just witnessed. Not the battle itself. The question after it. 4 seconds of looking at damage reports, and then, what do you need? When I came back out, the crew was already at work on repairs. B was back in an access channel. Darian was helping Linda with a minor pressure seal. Priya was recalculating our new course to allow for altered mass distribution from the hull damage. Everyone was doing the next thing that needed doing. I found Kofi in the main engineering section, already elbow deep in the first of the 3 damaged areas. I said, "Kofi, are you all right?" He looked up. He had a minor burn on his forearm from a power line that had discharged during the engagement. "Fine," he said. "This is fixable. More complicated than the sensor housing, but the same idea, really." I looked at the burn on his forearm. I said, "You should have Linda look at that." "Later," he said. "Hull breach needs to be sealed before the burn gets looked at. It is fine. It does not hurt that much." He paused. "Well, it hurts. But it is fine." He turned back to the hull section. I stood there for a moment, watching him work. "It hurts, but it is fine." The sentence sat in my mind like a stone in still water, making rings. My field report that evening was not organized. It was not the methodical, structured, boring document I was known for. It was 37 pages of dense observation, with no clear headings, and several sections that I later realized contained essentially the same information written different ways, as I tried to find the right words. At the end of it, I wrote one paragraph that I have since quoted in 4 separate published papers and 2 official testimony submissions to the Hegemony Council. The paragraph said, "We have been categorizing species by their capacity for action. We measure how fast they can go, how accurately they can strike, how efficiently they use resources. These are meaningful measurements, but they are not the right measurements for humans, because the limiting factor for humans is not capacity. It is will. And their will, as far as I have been able to observe, does not appear to have a ceiling. They will endure what needs to be endured. They will do what needs to be done. They will ask if everyone is all right, and they will get back to work, and they will say it hurts, but it is fine. This is not stubbornness. It is not programming. It is choice, made again and again at every moment when a different choice was available. And that, I believe, is the thing we have been failing to measure. Not what they can do, what they will choose to do. The answer, as best I can tell, is whatever is necessary. And when they have done what is necessary, they will ask what you need, and then they will do that too. I sent that report to the Hegemony Council, with the subject line, "Immediate attention required." The council acknowledged receipt. They convened a session to discuss the Ketharon engagement. They sent a formal diplomatic note to the Vorkai Dominion about the unsanctioned military action. They did not, as far as I could tell, discuss the paragraph. They did not, as far as I could tell, discuss the humans at all, in any terms that reflected what I had tried to describe. 2 weeks later, I learned that the Hegemony Council was planning to issue a containment directive. They were going to restrict human movement, limit their operational area, and negotiate a cap on their warship production. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about Kofi and the burn on his forearm. I thought about B, emerging from the conduit channel asking about food. I thought about Priya recalculating courses while the ship moved through an active engagement. I thought about 40,000 people in a corridor, who were safe because one ship with 43 people had arrived 2 minutes early and said, "Turn around." And then I went to find Commander Ose, because if a directive was coming, she deserved to know. She heard me out, sitting at her desk with her coffee going cold in the cup at her elbow. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." Just that, one word. The same word that would shortly silence an entire council chamber. She said okay, and she meant it. And I could not quite tell whether that was the most peaceful response I had ever heard to an act of considerable institutional arrogance, or whether it was the most quietly dangerous one. Maybe it was both. The Hegemony Grand Council chamber is a beautiful room. I have been in it 3 times in my career, and each time I am struck by how deliberate the beauty is. The curved walls inlaid with the mineral patterns of a dozen different member worlds, the ceiling that shifts through the colors of Hegemony sunsets over the course of a session, the seats arranged in a perfect arc so that every member can see every other member, and none of them are positioned higher or lower than their peers. It is a room designed to communicate equality and permanence, and the weight of careful decision. It is a room designed for exactly the kind of slow, measured, deliberate governance that had built the hegemony into the largest stable political entity in this region of space. I believed in that governance. I had spent my whole career believing in it. I had submitted 41 years of field reports into its information systems because I believed that careful information, carefully processed, produced good outcomes. I stood in front of the council on a morning in early cycle and delivered my testimony, and I tried very hard not to betray the fact that I was afraid, not of the council, not of the chamber, afraid that I had somehow failed to communicate something essential in all the reports I had filed and all the pages I had written, and that the failure was going to have consequences I could not yet predict. Grand Counselor Methura was the senior member presiding that day. He was an old being, experienced in ways that I respected, with a record of careful governance that had served the hegemony well for 2 decades. He was also, as I was about to discover, operating with an information model about humans that was approximately as accurate as a map drawn from memory by someone who had heard about the terrain from a friend who had never been there. I presented my full field data. I showed the footage from Ketharan, the 11 minutes of engagement, the damage assessment that followed, Kofi at work with a burn on his forearm. I presented the physiological analysis, the behavioral documentation, the 412 communications. I showed them the medical files I had obtained with permission, the accumulated records of healed fractures, old injuries, the physical history of people who had pushed their bodies well past comfortable limits, and then kept going. I spoke for 3 hours. The council listened politely. Several members asked questions that were detailed and intelligent. Grand Counselor Methura himself asked several follow-up questions that told me he had read at least portions of my written reports. And then came the question I had been dreading. He looked at me across the chamber and said, "Xenobiologist Vale Curran, your reports paint a vivid picture, but you have been embedded with a single human vessel, a single crew, for a period of weeks. Is it not possible that this crew represents an exceptional case? That you have, perhaps, developed some personal attachment that has colored your analysis?" I breathed. I took a specific moment to breathe before answering, because this was the question I had prepared for, and I wanted to answer it correctly. "Grand Counselor," I said, "I have asked myself that question repeatedly. The answer is that the crew of the Relentless is exceptional, in the way that any highly trained, experienced team is exceptional. They are very good at what they do. But what they do is not unique to them. Their capacity for endurance, their baseline relationship with risk, their willingness to act without institutional authorization when the situation requires it, these are human traits. I have the cross-referenced literature from the 23 other human vessels in current operation in this region. The pattern is consistent. The Relentless is not an anomaly. They are an example." Methura nodded. Then he said, "They are one species on one planet. What can they truly do?" I have thought about that moment many times since, about what I should have said and what I did say, and what the difference was. What I should have said was, everything, anything they decide to. Give them time, and they will show you. But that was not what came out. What came out was, "Counselor, I believe you are about to find out." It was quiet for a moment. Then the council moved on to the formal deliberation, and I was asked to wait in the anteroom while they discussed. The anteroom had a view of the planet below through a narrow curved window. I stood at that window and looked at the surface of Hegemony Central, the capital world of the largest political entity in this region of space, and I thought about one ship with 43 people and a coffee machine that was always on. I thought about the containment directive. I thought about what would happen when a human who had been told okay was told that okay was no longer an option. I was still thinking about it when the council's secretary came to tell me the vote had passed. The containment directive would be issued within 36 hours. Human vessels would be restricted to sectors designated by the hegemony. Human shipbuilding would be subject to hegemony-supervised caps. There would be monitoring. There would be enforcement. I thanked the secretary and walked back to my assigned quarters, and I drafted the most difficult message I had ever had to write. Not because it contained bad news. I had delivered bad news before. But because I had spent 11 months observing the people this message was going to, and I knew, with a certainty that felt very close to shame, that we were making a mistake of historic proportion. I sent it to Commander Osei directly. I explained what had been decided. I explained the reasoning, as best I understood it. I told her I had argued against it, for all the good that had done, and that I was sorry. Her response came 4 hours later. It said, "Vale Curran, thank you for telling me directly. That matters. We will comply with the directive. See you soon. There is a lot going on up here, and Kofi just made something for dinner that I think you will genuinely enjoy." I read that 3 times. Then I booked the earliest available transport back to the Relentless. When I arrived, 2 days later, the directive had been formally communicated to the human fleet. All 23 vessels currently operating in hegemony-accessible space. The responses from the other vessels had ranged from terse to philosophical. Osei's response, on behalf of the Relentless, had been the one-word reply that the hegemony's diplomatic receiving office had apparently spent an entire afternoon trying to decode. They had sent 3 follow-up requests for clarification. She had not replied to any of them. Because okay meant okay. It was not code. It was not protest. It was not a veiled threat. She was going to comply with the directive, and she did not feel the need to add anything to that compliance. And the hegemony's uncertainty about what to do with okay was, I thought, the clearest possible illustration of everything I had been trying to explain in my reports. We expected resistance. We expected negotiation. We expected the full machinery of diplomatic pushback that any established civilization would deploy in response to a significant restriction of its operational freedom. We expected the humans to behave like any other political entity faced with an unwelcome directive. They said okay. They moved into the designated sectors. They filed the required compliance documentation with scrupulous accuracy and completeness, not a single required element missing from a single report. Within 72 hours of the directive taking effect, every human vessel in monitored space was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, in full, visible, verifiable compliance. And then they started doing things we had not anticipated at all. I watched it begin on my second day back aboard the Relentless. Osei held a meeting in the main gathering room with her senior crew, and I was invited to attend as an observer. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At no point during those 3 hours did anyone complain about the directive, express frustration about the restrictions, or argue about what should be done. They spent 3 hours talking about what could be done within the designated sectors, what opportunities existed in the space they were authorized to use, what work was possible, what contacts could be made, what they could build from what they had. Priya spread navigational charts across the table and began identifying survey opportunities in the designated areas that no one had prioritized before, because the space had seemed less interesting than the regions now restricted. Darian produced a list of species and civilizations operating within the designated sectors that the Relentless had not yet made formal contact with. Kofi started sketching modifications to the ship's communication systems that would extend their range within the designated boundary without crossing it. They were not making the best of a bad situation. They were genuinely, methodically, inventively, engaging with the situation as it existed and building from it. There was something almost remarkable about watching it in real time. The restriction had not reduced their energy, it had just redirected it. Within the first week, the Relentless made contact with the Drun. The Drun were a species operating near the inner boundary of the designated sector, previously classified in hegemony records as a minor civilization in early development, not yet considered significant by any of the major powers. They had excellent engineers and a complex and fascinating history and, as it turned out, a profound interest in meeting other species that they had not previously had the opportunity to act on, because no major vessel had come to them. The Relentless came to them. Osei spent 2 days in initial contact. She learned 30 words of Drun sign language. Their primary communication was partially manual, well enough to open conversations in their own language. She did this not because it was required, or because it conferred any tactical advantage, but because, as she told me, it matters to people when you try. It matters a lot. She was right. The Drun responded to her effort with the warmth of people who had been waiting to be seen. Within 3 days, they had an open information-sharing agreement. Within a week, Kofi was teaching a group of Drun engineers the principles of the hard-stop FTL maneuver, and they were teaching him a structural technique for self-sealing hull sections that he immediately recognized as superior to anything the Relentless currently used. I watched this and I wrote in my notes, "This is not what we expected. We expected them to wait. We expected compliance to mean stillness. We expected the directive to function as we intended it. as a reduction of influence, a narrowing of reach, a slowing of a momentum that had concerned us. It is not functioning that way. They are not waiting. They are growing a different kind of network, in the space we gave them, at a speed we did not predict, through means we were not watching for. My weekly report to the Council, that cycle was titled, "The Directive is Not Producing Its Intended Effect." I explained what I was seeing. I explained the drone contact, and the information sharing agreement, and the structural technique exchange. I explained that OSE was already in communication with 4 other minor species operating in the designated sectors, all of whom had responded with equivalent warmth to equivalent effort. I explained that the humans had not become less connected in the last 30 days. They had become more connected, in a different direction, through a different kind of relationship. The Council acknowledged the report. They did not change the directive. 3 weeks later, the Ash people of Velterra sent a formal communication to the Relentless. The Ash people were considered, in hegemony classification, a Level 2 civilization, with limited interstellar capacity and no significant political weight. They had been operating in the outer zone of the designated sector for generations, largely ignored by the major powers, because they had nothing the major powers wanted in any immediately obvious way. Commander Osei had found them in Darian's list. She had reached out. They had reached back. And now they were sending a communication that said, "In careful translated standard, we are grateful to have been remembered. We have information about transit patterns in the outer zone that may be of use. We are willing to share. Information about transit patterns in the outer zone. Information that no hegemony survey vessel had ever asked for, because the outer zone had seemed too minor to bother mapping in detail. Information that Priya, when I showed it to her, immediately identified as filling 3 significant gaps in our navigational charts for that region. The Ash people had been out there the entire time, quietly knowing things, waiting for someone to ask. Osei had asked. I filed another report. I titled it, "The Humans Are Not Contained." I meant it literally. The directive had given them a box, and they had immediately begun building relationships within the box, and the relationships were producing information and trust and a kind of quiet, unofficial network that had no name and no paperwork and was growing every day. A network made not of treaties or trade agreements but of genuine connection, of 30 words learned in someone else's language, of information shared freely, of Kofi teaching a drone engineer how to arrive somewhere like you mean it. The hegemony had tried to contain humanity. Humanity had responded by connecting with everyone in the container and then sending warm greetings to everyone near the outside of it and asking if there was anything they could do to help. I wrote one final note in my field document for that period. It said, "I think the Council believes that if you limit someone's space, you limit their power. I think the humans believe that power is not about space. I think they believe power is about relationships, about who knows you, and trusts you, and would answer if you called. About how many people have learned 30 words of your language because someone thought it was worth the effort. They have been in their designated sectors for 45 days, and they have more genuine relationships in those sectors than the hegemony has built in 300 years of operating through them. I do not know how to make the Council understand this in terms they will act on. I am not sure it can be understood until it is witnessed, and I am afraid the witnessing is going to come at a cost. I was right about that, but I did not know how right. I did not know what the witnessing was going to be, or how soon it was going to arrive, or the scale of what it was going to cost. I only knew that something was coming, the way the sky sometimes feels before a storm, not by any visible change, but by a quality of waiting in the air that every creature with working senses can feel. It came on a night when most of the crew was asleep, when the ship was running quietly through the inner zone of the designated sector on a standard survey pass, when Priya was on bridge watch, and I was in my room reviewing notes. My monitoring system chimed, and I looked at it, and I saw the alert that had come in from the hegemony's deep sensor network, an anomalous reading in the outer dark. Not a ship, not a debris field, not anything that matched any known category in the database. Something large, something moving, something that the sensor network had flagged as unknown but prioritized at the highest alert level, which the network only did in response to patterns that had previously been associated with significant threats. I sat with that alert for a long time. I thought about the conclave of records, about the phrase "the undying tide," about the reason that phrase appeared in the deepest archival layers of the hegemony's oldest databases, the ones that contained information about civilizations that no longer existed. Then I got up and went to find Commander Osei. She was already awake. She was at her desk when I knocked, which meant she had been awake for some time, which meant she had received the alert through a channel I was not monitoring, which meant the humans had their own access to deep sensor data that the hegemony had not been informed about. Under the circumstances, I did not raise this as a concern. I raised the other thing. "You have seen it," I said. "Yes," she said. She had a cup of coffee in her hand. She was looking at a display that showed a map of the outer dark, with a cluster of anomalous sensor readings plotted in red. The cluster was moving in a direction. "Come in." I came in. I sat down. I looked at the display. "What do you know about what the Conclave of Records calls the undying tide?" I said. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. Something careful. "Enough," she said. "We have records. We did our research when we got out here." She paused. "Does the hegemony know how long it has been dormant?" "The last confirmed encounter was 412 years ago," I said. "The civilization that encountered it no longer exists." She put the coffee down. She looked at the display for a moment. Then she pulled up a communication panel and said, "To the open channel, Priya, all stop. Wake the crew. Priority meeting in 10 minutes. Do not use the alarm. Just wake people." She looked at me. "You should stay for this meeting," she said, "and then you should file whatever you need to file, because this is about to get very complicated, and the hegemony is going to need to know about it from someone they trust." She used the word trust, applied to me, on behalf of the council that had dismissed my reports, approved a containment directive against her people, and responded to my most critical assessments with, "Acknowledged." I think about that moment sometimes, about what it took for her to use that word in that context, with that casualness, as though it was simply obvious, as though trust was a thing she distributed generously because she had enough of it and it cost her nothing to give. I filed my report within the hour. The subject line was, "Immediate attention required. Critical escalation. Possible emergence." What I did not know as I filed it was that I was filing it into a hegemony council that was about to face something it had not faced in 400 years, and that the only answer it was going to find to that something was going to come from the species it had spent the last 2 months trying to contain. The circle of that irony was not lost on me. I suspect it was not lost on Commander Osei either, but she did not say anything about it. She finished her coffee, called her crew to their meeting, and started working the problem. That was what she did. That was what they all did. When something required working, they worked it. When something required endurance, they endured. When something required asking for help, they asked. Without pride, without hesitation, in 30 words of sign language if that was what was needed. And when something required them to show up, they showed up. 1 ship, or 43 ships, or however many were needed. They showed up, and they did what was necessary, and then they asked if everyone was all right. The next morning, the Hegemony Grand Council received my report. They also received, independently, the deep sensor alert, and for the first time in a very long session, the council chamber was genuinely, completely quiet. The emergency session of the Hegemony Grand Council lasted 19 hours. I was present for 14 of them, having been recalled from the Relentless, by urgent summons, the day after the deep sensor alert. I sat at the outer ring of the chamber, in the seat reserved for expert witnesses, and I answered questions until my voice was rough, and my notes were covered in the small, tired handwriting of someone who has been explaining the same thing too many times to people who need to understand it quickly. The counselors were not foolish people. I want to be clear about that. They were experienced, careful, politically skilled individuals who had navigated complex situations for decades. What they lacked was not intelligence. What they lacked was a frame of reference for the specific information I was giving them, and 400 years of institutional confidence that the hegemony's tools and methods were sufficient for anything the galaxy could produce. The Undying Tide was not a name in the General Archive. It was a name in the Restricted Archive, the one that required senior clearance and a specific research justification to access. I had accessed it once, years ago, during a comparative study of pre-hegemony civilizations, and I had read the relevant entries with the detached academic interest of someone studying historical events. I had not, at the time, read them with urgency, because nothing in my professional experience had suggested I would ever need to. Now I needed to. Now we all needed to. And what the restricted archive said, stripped of the careful scholarly language and the diplomatic hedging of 900 years of accumulated commentary, was this. The undying tide was a phenomenon of unknown origin that moved through inhabited space in cycles of dormancy and activity, and in its active phases, it consumed everything it encountered. Not selectively, not preferentially. Everything. The civilization that had encountered it 400 years ago had been the Vethar, a species that the hegemony's records called advanced and capable and well-established, with a fleet and a history, and a home system that had existed for centuries. The Vethar had lasted 11 days from first contact with the tide. Then they were gone. The archive entry for their species ended mid-sentence in the last surviving record, the way a conversation ends when the room goes dark. I presented this to the council. I presented the sensor data that I had collected with Osei's assistance, the trajectory analysis that Priya had run before I left the Relentless, the estimated timeline to contact with inhabited systems if the tide continued on its current heading. I presented, as carefully and as plainly as I could, the conclusion that no available hegemony military asset was positioned to intercept the tide before it reached the first inhabited system on its path, which happened to be a minor world with a population of approximately 8 million beings. The council deliberated for 4 hours. I sat in the anteroom again, looking at the same window and the same planet below. This time I was not thinking about the humans. I was thinking about the Vethar, whose last record ended mid-sentence, and about 8 million beings on a minor world who did not know what was coming toward them. When they called me back in, Grand Counselor Methura looked older than he had the last time I stood in front of him. He looked like a person who had been told something they could not put down. Xenobiologist Vale Curran, he said, we are going to need to reach out to other civilizations for assistance in responding to this threat. The chorus of aligned worlds has been notified. The Dominion has been notified. We are assessing what assets each can contribute. He paused. There is a discussion about whether to reach out to humanity, given the current directive status. I waited. He looked at me. I said, carefully, is there a question for me in that statement, Counselor? Yes, he said. Is it your assessment that humanity can make a meaningful contribution to a defensive operation of this scale? I thought about Priya calculating transit paths in real time during an 11-minute engagement. I thought about Kofi fixing a sensor housing while humming in a microparticle debris field. I thought about Darian, who read philosophy in his off-duty hours, and the 63 pages of tactical analysis I had written about what he had done at Ketharon. I thought about B, 23 years old, 4 hours in a conduit channel. Yes, I said, that is my assessment. And will they respond to a formal request? Methura said. Given that we have issued a directive that restricts their operations, is there a concern that they may decline? I thought about Commander Osei's face when I had told her about the 8 million beings on the minor world's path. I had told her before I left the Relentless, because she deserved to know what the sensor data meant. She had listened. She had not said anything immediately. Then she had said, are they going to ask us for help or are they going to try to handle this themselves? I had said I did not know yet. She had said, let me know when you find out. We are ready either way. Ready either way. The directive still technically in force, the hegemony still technically having restricted their operational area, and Nora Osei, sitting at her desk in her small office on her patchwork ship, saying ready either way. No, I told Methura, there is no concern that they will decline. The formal request was transmitted that afternoon. It went to all 23 human vessels currently operating in designated sectors, through their registered communication channels, in properly formatted hegemony diplomatic standard. It outlined the situation. It requested assistance. It included, as a formal amendment, the suspension of the containment directive for the duration of the crisis. The response came back in 40 minutes. Not the one-word response of a civilization that had learned to express volumes through brevity. A full, complete, detailed response from Commander Osei on behalf of the human fleet, outlining available assets, current positions, proposed tactical approaches, estimated arrival times, and a list of Drun and Ash people of Veltaris and Mukeen vessels that would be joining them. A list of allies. Allies that had been made in 45 days of operating within the designated sectors, through 30 words of sign language, and an invitation to teach, and a question about whether everyone was all right. The council read that list. I watched them read it. I watched Methura's expression as he went through the names of the minor species, the ones the hegemony had classified as not yet significant, who were apparently now volunteering their vessels and their crews to assist in the largest defensive operation the region had seen in 4 centuries. He looked up at me. I did not say anything. What was there to say? The map had always shown a road. Now the mountain was visible, and the humans had been climbing it since before we asked them to. The first human vessel arrived at the staging point 22 hours ahead of the chorus fleet. It was not the Relentless. It was a larger ship I had not previously encountered, a carrier-class vessel called the Endurance, carrying a complement of short-range fighters and a crew of 200. Its captain was a broad, gray-haired man named Owen, who spoke 4 languages and had an expression of permanent mild interest in his surroundings, as though the universe was an ongoing project he was curious to see develop. He met the hegemony's coordinating officer with a firm handshake and immediately asked for access to the full sensor data on the tide's current position and heading. The coordinating officer gave him the data. Owen looked at it for 90 seconds, called someone on his crew, talked to them for 3 minutes, and came back with a suggested adjustment to the defensive perimeter that would, as the hegemony's tactical analysis subsequently confirmed, reduce the tide's effective approach angle by 11 degrees. 11 degrees that, in practice, meant the defended position could be held with fewer vessels in one of the more vulnerable approaches. He offered this without fanfare, without waiting to be asked. Just, here is a thing that would help. Would you like it? The second human vessel arrived 8 hours later. Then 3 more together. Then a group of 6, traveling in formation with 4 Drun ships in a configuration that the hegemony's navigational systems had never seen before, but that Priya later explained to me was a mutual shielding formation developed through 6 weeks of cooperative practice between the Drun engineers and the Relentless crew. They had been developing it for 6 weeks, in the designated sectors, while complying with the directive, while saying okay and meaning it, and then doing the next thing. The Relentless arrived with the main fleet, a deployment I could not have counted quickly because I was not expecting the scale of it. I stood at the observation port of the hegemony staging station, and I counted, and then I counted again, because I thought I had miscounted. Then I called for Queth, who had found me at the staging station, and was working from a station nearby, and I said, "Count those ships, count all of them." Queth counted. He counted for a long time. Then he came back and said, quietly, "Vale Curran, a significant portion of those are not human ships." "I know," I said. "The Drun have sent 7 vessels," he said. "The Ash people of Veltaris have sent 3. The Mukeen have sent 2. There is a ship class I do not recognize. The registry says it is from a species called the Velhan, which is not in our database at all. Also probably in the designated sectors," I said. "Also probably someone Osei met in the last 2 months." Queth looked at the display for a long time. Then he said, "She made friends with all of them. In 45 days. 30 words of sign language at a time," I said. We stood there for a while in quiet. The assembled fleet on the display was larger than anything the hegemony had mobilized in a generation. A significant portion of it was here because a human commander had asked how someone was doing and meant it, and had shared information freely, and taught a skill with genuine enthusiasm, and said thank you in the right language, and left people feeling seen. The hegemony had 300 years of diplomatic history in these sectors. The humans had 45 days and a coffee machine that was always on. I did not send a report to the council that night. There was nothing I could add to the visual data. They could see the display. They could count the ships. Sometimes the evidence speaks clearly enough that commentary only reduces it. The undying tide arrived at the defensive perimeter 41 hours after the first human vessel reached the staging point. In those 41 hours, Owen and Osei and the other human commanders had run 11 planning sessions with the hegemony's coordinating officers, the chorus military representatives, and the commanders of the Drun and Ash people and Mukeen vessels. They had developed and discarded 3 different tactical approaches and settled on a 4th that incorporated ideas from every species present, including a navigational suggestion from a Velhan commander, whose people had apparently spent generations observing the outer dark and had information about the tide's movement patterns that no other source had preserved. The Velhan suggestion was the one that made the fourth approach work. A civilization not in any hegemony database, found by a human commander doing 30-minute outreach sessions with every registered vessel in her designated sector. The engagement itself lasted 11 days, not 11 minutes. 11 days of sustained, complex, high-pressure defensive operations against something that did not tire, did not negotiate, did not stop, something that had not been stopped in 400 years, something that had ended a civilization that the archives called advanced and capable, and that had left their last record ending mid-sentence. I am not going to describe the 11 days in detail in this account. I described them in a 69-page technical report filed 3 weeks after the engagement, which is available through the hegemony's restricted archives. What I will say is that the humans made 2 tactical innovations during those 11 days that I had never seen before, and that no existing military doctrine contained. The first was developed by Darien, who had been reading materials completely unrelated to spacecraft combat throughout his off-duty hours for years, and had apparently been accumulating, without knowing it, the pieces of an insight about the tide's movement pattern that became apparent only when he had all the pieces in one place at the right moment. He brought it to Owen and Osei during the 4th day, quietly, with the same lack of drama that characterized everything he did, and said, "I think I have something." He had something. The something bought them 3 days. The second innovation was Kofi's, and it was named, as I mentioned I would note and will now note, after a snack food. He called it a popcorn jump, and the name made sense once you understood what it did, which was to use a very rapid series of micro-FTL transitions to generate a dispersal pattern that disrupted the tide's coherence at the leading edge. He invented it during a 12-hour stretch of continuous problem-solving that the ship's logs show he conducted without significant sleep, fueled by coffee, and the particular human state of mind that activates when they are very close to an answer and cannot stop working until they find it. The popcorn jump bought them the remaining 7 days. On the 11th day, the tide's coherence collapsed, not because it was defeated in any traditional sense. The technical details are complex and the report covers them properly, but because the combination of Darien's insight and Kofi's innovation and 11 days of coordinated effort by every species present had pushed it past a threshold it had apparently not been pushed past before. It dispersed. It ceased to be a unified phenomenon. And then it was gone, and the space where it had been was just space again, empty and cold, and containing no threat that any sensor could detect. Commander Osei opened a channel to all vessels. She said, "Check in. Damage reports to your fleet coordinators. Medical needs to Owen's medical network first." She paused. "Is everyone all right?" The answers came back. They took a while, because there were a lot of vessels, damage reports, casualty numbers. The hegemony fleet had lost 3 ships. The chorus had lost 2. The drun had lost 1. The human fleet had lost no ships, though several were significantly damaged, and 41 crew members across the human vessels had been killed in the 11 days of engagement. 41 people. I want to put that number down plainly, without qualification, because each of those 41 was a person who had made a choice to be in that engagement and had not come through it. Whatever I say about human resilience and endurance and the domestication of fear, I want to be clear that the cost was real. That 41 was not an abstraction. That Osei knew every one of those names already and would learn each story and carry each one. She did what I will describe in the final part of this account. But first she made sure all the living were accounted for. She checked on the drun, the ash people, the Mukeen. She asked Owen if the Velhan commander needed anything. She asked the hegemony coordinating officer if there was anything the human medical network could offer to the wounded from other vessels. And then she came to find me, because she knew I was on the staging station, because she had been keeping track of that too. I was in the observation room when she arrived. She sat down next to me. She had coffee. She had, apparently, brought me coffee too. She handed me a cup without comment, as though this was the obvious thing to do. We sat and looked at the display together, at the dispersed sensor readings where the tide had been, at the battered fleet arranged across the defensive perimeter, at the minor world it had been heading toward, still intact, 8 million beings who would not know until much later how close the moment had been. I did not say anything. Neither did she for a while. Then she said, "What happens now? With the directive?" I said, "I believe the directive will be repealed. I do not think the council will maintain it after this." She nodded. She looked at the display. "Good," she said. Not triumphant, not weighted with implication, just good, as though the repeal of the directive was a reasonable outcome to a reasonable situation, not a vindication, not a victory, just a sensible thing that she was glad to know was coming. I thought about the word okay. I thought about all the meanings packed into very small containers. I said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at me. "For what?" "For the council," I said. "I should have communicated better. My reports were not sufficient. I did not find the way to make them understand, and they made a decision based on incomplete understanding, and I was the one responsible for the information." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Vale Kurin, you argued against the directive. You told them what you saw. What they did with it was their choice, not your failure." She paused. "Also, for what it is worth, I think you communicated exactly right. I think they just were not ready to hear it yet. Sometimes people need to see the mountain before they believe the map was wrong." I thought about that, about seeing the mountain, about the 41 crew members who had died in 11 days, while the hegemony found a way to look at the mountain and understand what it was. I thought about whether there was a version of those 11 days where the understanding had come earlier and the cost had been different. I did not find a comfortable answer. I do not think there is one. What I know is this: we had one chance to understand. We were given that chance, slowly and clearly, in 41 years of my career, and 400 messages between a xenobiologist and a human commander, and 11 months aboard a ship that wore its history on its hull. We were given the chance, and we did not take it, and the taking of it came later, at a price. That is the only thing I truly regret. Not the directive itself, not the containment, not the mistakes of institutional caution and insufficient imagination. Just the cost. Just the 41 names that Osei would read aloud, clearly, at a ceremony I had not yet witnessed but already knew she would hold. I finished my coffee. She finished hers. Outside, the fleet was beginning its slow post-engagement dispersal, each vessel moving toward the position it needed to reach for repair and resupply, and the particular quiet that comes after sustained effort, when the effort has finally ended. The Relentless needed significant work before it could travel comfortably. Kofi was already making the assessment list. I could hear him on the open channel, moving through the ship section by section, his voice calm and steady, and carrying the same quality it always carried when there was work to be done. Interested, as though the work was a puzzle, and the puzzle was worth solving, and the solving was the whole point. It hurts, but it is fine. Fix what breaks, and keep going. I had been looking for a word, for months, for what the humans were. I had been trying to find it in all the languages I knew, across all the species I had studied in 41 years. I had not found it. But sitting there with Osei, looking at the display, I thought I was finally close. They were people who did not stop. Not because they could not stop. They could rest. They did rest. They felt things fully, and they sometimes sat in the dark with the weight of what had happened, and they cried. They absolutely cried. I had seen it, and I had noted it, and I had understood it, as the honest response of beings who carried things, rather than putting them down. They did not stop because stopping was a choice they kept declining to make, because every time stopping was available, they looked at it, and then they looked at the next thing that needed doing, and they did the next thing. I did not have the word, but I had the shape of it now, and the shape of it looked like a woman sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, after 11 days of something that had broken an entire ancient civilization, asking if everyone was all right. That was the shape of it. That was the whole shape of it. The memorial was held 4 days after the engagement ended, in the open cargo bay of the Endurance, which was the largest interior space the human fleet could offer, and still not quite large enough for everyone who wanted to attend. Crew members from other vessels transferred over by shuttle. The Drun sent a representative. The Ash people of Veltaris sent a message that Osei read aloud at the beginning, which said, in their carefully translated words, that grief shared between those who fought together is not divided, but multiplied into something stronger, then either could carry alone. I thought about that sentence for a long time. I still think about it. Owen stood at the front of the room in his plain gray uniform and said a few words about the engagement, about what had been accomplished, about the people who had not made it through. He did not speak for long. He was not the kind of person who inflated moments with extra words. He said what was true and he stopped. Then Osei stepped forward. She had a list. I knew before she began reading that she would read every name on it. 41 names from across the human fleet. People from ships I had not spent time on. People I had never met. She had learned something about each of them, I discovered later. In the 4 days between the engagement's end and the memorial, she had spoken to their captains and their crewmates, and she had found one specific thing about each person. Not an achievement, not a rank, not a professional summary. Something that was just them. Just who they were. A detail, a quality, a story. She read each name, and then she said the thing she had found. She did not rush. She did not abbreviate. 41 names, 41 people, 41 specific true things about who they were in the world. It took a long time. No one in the room moved or made a sound that was not grief. I was standing at the edge of the crowd, and I am a scientist who has built a career on the disciplined management of emotional response in observation settings, and I am telling you that I did not maintain that discipline during the reading of those names. I am telling you that because I think it is relevant data, because my physiological response was not a departure from professional objectivity. I think it was the only professionally accurate response available. I think losing that discipline was, in that moment, the only honest thing I could do. When she finished, Osei looked up from the list. She said, "They knew what they were doing. They chose it anyway. That is who we are." She folded the list once, carefully, and put it in the inner pocket of her uniform, over her chest. Then she said, "If there is anyone here who needs to talk, the lounge on level 2 is open. Kofi is there. He has made food. You do not have to be alone." That was the end of the memorial. People stayed. They talked and they held on to each other, and they ate the food that Kofi had made, which was, I should note, excellent. Kofi was an extraordinary cook on top of everything else, which I had not previously mentioned, because it had not seemed like critical professional data. I mention it now because I think it is part of the same thing, because the food mattered, because he had made it and was offering it, and it was a way of saying, "I see you, and you do not have to be alone," which is something that could not be said adequately in words, but could be said adequately in food, and so he said it in food. I sat in the lounge for 2 hours. I talked to crew members I had not spoken to before, people from the Endurance and from 3 other vessels whose names I had seen on reports but not on faces. They were so various, so different from each other in manner and history and personality, and yet the same in the thing that mattered, the underlying architecture, the basic relationship with what was hard, and what was necessary, and what came next. I could see it in all of them, the shared spine, the domesticated fear, the willingness to do the next thing because the next thing needed doing. I thought about the Hegemony's crew evaluation protocols, the psychological screening, the compatibility testing, the exhaustive certification processes that governed who could serve where and under what conditions. They were excellent protocols. They produced capable crews. I had served on Hegemony vessels my whole career, and I had always trusted those protocols. But they were protocols for building a crew that worked well. The humans were something different. They were 43, or 200, or however many the situation required. People who had chosen to be here, not because a protocol matched them or a certification cleared them, but because they had found a thing worth doing, and people worth doing it with. And that choice, made daily, renewed daily, was what made them what they were. I filed no report that night. I ate the food Kofi made. I talked to people I had not met. I thought about 41 names and 41 specific true things. And at the end of the evening, walking back through the corridors of the Endurance, toward the transport that would take me back to my temporary station quarters, I passed a wall. I almost walked past it without stopping. Then I stopped. The wall was covered in photographs, not digitally projected, not screen displayed, but printed on material, and attached to the wall in a dense mosaic that covered nearly every centimeter of a full corridor section. Photographs of people, many people, some clearly from a long time ago by the color quality of the image, some recent enough that the reproduction was sharp and vivid. They were all in uniform or near uniform. Some were smiling. Some were in environments I recognized as space. Some in environments I could not immediately identify. Some were alone and some were in groups. All of them were dead. This was the Endurance's memorial wall, the physical record of everyone the ship had lost in its years of operation, and it stretched far enough down the corridor that I could not see the end of it from where I stood. I stood there for a while, longer than I intended to, looking at faces I did not know, from histories I had not studied, in a corridor on a ship I had been aboard for less than a week. I looked at the faces, and I thought about what it meant to maintain this wall, to add to it, to walk past it every day going to and from the bridge, the engineering section, the lounge, and to see those faces and carry their presence forward into whatever the day contained. Owen found me there. He stopped when he saw me, and he did not say anything immediately. He stood next to me and looked at the wall with me. After a moment he said, "This is the part that people outside the crew always have trouble with." "The size of it," I said. "The size of it," he agreed. "Some visitors see it and they think, this is what war costs. And that is not wrong, but it is also not quite right." He looked at the faces. These were not all lost in combat. Some were accidents. Some were illness. Some were just life, in a dangerous place. The wall is not a record of sacrifice. It is a record of people who were here, who were part of this ship. He paused. We walk past it every day, because it would be wrong to forget, and because they were worth the remembering, every single one. I looked at the wall. I thought about the hegemony's protocols for crew loss, the efficient documentation, the respectful but procedurally contained acknowledgement processes, the professional grief counseling scheduled at appropriate intervals, all of it designed to allow the institution to continue functioning without being overwhelmed by the weight of what it had cost. The wall was the opposite of that. The wall was the accumulated weight, preserved and maintained, not minimized, not managed, but just there, available, present. You could not walk through that corridor without seeing every person who had been part of this ship and had not made it through. You could not pretend the cost was abstract, or that the institution was separate from the people it had consumed. The wall made the cost visible every day, and the ship kept flying. "Does it help?" I asked. "The wall. Is it easier to keep going because it is there?" Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is easier to keep going because we remember that they did, that they were here, and they kept going right up until they couldn't. And so we do too. Not for them, with them." He looked at the wall. "That probably sounds strange to you." "No," I said. "It does not sound strange at all." And it did not. Not anymore. Not after 11 months. I understood it now, in a way I could not have understood it before I came aboard, and drank the coffee, and read the card on the table in my room. The wall was part of the same thing that the card was part of, the same thing that the food was part of, the same thing that the 30 words of sign language were part of. They carried people. They carried them forward. They made them present instead of past. I took a very long time writing my next report, not because I did not know what to say, but because I did know what to say, and I wanted to say it correctly. The final version was 14 pages. It was the shortest substantive report I had ever filed. I had spent 41 years learning to write longer. I spent the next week learning to write shorter, because the substance was clearer, without the surrounding architecture. The council read it in the same session, where they formally voted to repeal the containment directive. The vote was unanimous. I was not in the chamber. I learned about it from Ose, who learned about it from the official communication that arrived on the Relentless while she was in engineering watching Kofi work, and who read the communication, looked up at me where I was reviewing notes nearby, and said, "They repealed it." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. Then she looked back at Kofi. "How long for the starboard conduit?" 3 days, Kofi said. "Maybe 2, if Bia helps." "Get Bia," she said, and went back to the plan she had been working on. The plan, I discovered, was for the next survey route. The Relentless was going to need 6 weeks of significant repair before it could run at full capacity, and Ose had already been in contact with 3 of the hegemony's nearest repair stations about scheduling, and had arranged for drone engineers to assist with the hull sections because the drone technique Kofi had learned was better for this particular type of damage, and had mapped a provisional survey path for when the ship was ready, that incorporated the information from the Ash people of Veltaris and the transit pattern data from the Velhan commander, and 3 new contact possibilities from species she had identified in the Deep Sector records during the 6 days between the engagement's end and this moment. 6 days. The engagement had ended 6 days ago. 41 crew members had been lost. The memorial had been held. The wall had been updated, and Osei had a new survey path planned, incorporating intelligence from allies she had made while operating under a containment directive, ready to execute as soon as the ship was repaired. I added a note to my field document. It said, "They do not recover and then return to the work. They carry the weight and they do the work at the same time. These are not separate phases. They are concurrent. This is the most important thing I have learned in 11 months. I do not know if I can fully explain it in a report. I am not sure it can be fully explained. I think it has to be witnessed." The hegemony sent me a formal communication shortly after the directive was repealed. It informed me that the Grand Council wished to express its appreciation for my work as the embedded xenobiologist with the human fleet, and to advise me that my findings had been, and here the communication used a phrase that I want to record precisely, instrumental in shaping the Council's evolving understanding of humanity's position in the galactic community. The communication requested that I prepare a comprehensive summary report for presentation to the full Council at my earliest convenience. I transmitted back that I would prepare the report. I did not tell them what I intended the summary to say, because the summary was going to be difficult for them to hear, and I needed to write it before I delivered it, so that I could get it exactly right. The summary said, among other things, "You were not wrong to be cautious. Caution about unknown civilizations is appropriate, and we should maintain it as a policy foundation. What you were wrong about was the direction of the caution. We were cautious about what humans might do to us. We should have been paying attention to what humans were doing for us, and around us, and beside us, in the space we gave them. We gave them 45 days in a restricted sector and they built an alliance. We gave them a defensive crisis, and they brought that alliance to it. We lost 41 people across the human fleet, and within 6 days the commanders of that fleet had a new survey plan, and an expanded intelligence network, and a working relationship with a civilization we had not previously documented. This is not a threat. This is the single greatest asset the hegemony has encountered in 300 years of expansion. We need to think carefully about what that means, and what we do with it. Not what we do with them. They are not ours to do things with. What we do with the understanding. What we change about how we see the galaxy, now that we know what is in it. I thought for a long time about how to end the summary, about what the last line should be. In the end, I wrote something simple, because simple was right. I wrote, "Meet them the way they meet everyone, with your hands open and your questions ready. Say hello in their language if you can learn it. Ask what they need, and mean it when you ask. And when they smile at you, do not look it up in a database. Just smile back." The formal council presentation took place 6 weeks after the engagement. By then, I had been back on Hegemony Central for 2 weeks, living in my standard faculty quarters, and working through my notes in a way that felt different from any previous review I had conducted. Usually I approached my notes as data to be processed, organized, categorized, synthesized into conclusions. This time I kept finding myself simply reading them, sitting with a page, and not moving to the next one for an hour, because the page itself contained something I was not finished thinking about. The preliminary briefing before the formal presentation was attended by 12 senior council members, 4 military commanders, 3 diplomatic leads, and 2 members of the Hegemony's Scientific Advisory Board. I had presented to groups this size before, and usually I approached such presentations with the methodical calm of someone who has prepared extensively and knows their material. This time I was aware, in a way I had not been in previous presentations, that what I said mattered, in a specific urgent way, not just professionally, the way things matter when you have stood in a corridor, looking at a wall full of faces, and understood, fully, what the cost of not understanding looks like. I opened with something I had never opened a presentation with before. I opened with the question that Grand Counselor Methura had asked me in the first council session about humans. I quoted it exactly. "They are one species on one planet. What can they truly do?" Then I said, "I have an answer to that question now. I want to give it to you properly." I presented for 3 hours. I used footage, data, the cross-referenced medical files, the tactical analysis from Ketharon, and from the 11-day engagement. I used Priya's navigational calculations, running on a display that showed in real time the complexity of what she had been doing during combat. I used the structural technique that the drone engineers had shared with Kofi, running a side-by-side comparison with current hegemony methods that made the improvement immediately visible. I used a voice recording, played with Osei's permission, of the moment she had said, "Is everyone all right?" after Ketharon, followed by 40,000 responses coming back from the convoy, one after another. Safe, safe, safe. The chamber was completely quiet during that part. I had planned to speak over it. I decided not to. I let the sound fill the room. 40,000 confirmations of safety from beings who did not know they had been in danger until it was past. And I watched the council members listen to it, and I watched their faces, and I saw in several of them the same expression I had seen on Soth's face the first time we stepped off the transport onto the Relentless. Wonder. Carefully contained. The nearest a disciplined hegemony professional got to awe. After the presentation, the questions were better than they had been in the previous session. More specific. More willing to sit with complexity, rather than seeking quick categorization. Methura asked whether, in my assessment, the human inclination to act without authorization, the Ketharon response, the immediate preparation upon receiving the deep sensor data, was a risk factor or an asset. I told him both, and that the proportion of risk to asset depended almost entirely on whether humanity considered you a partner or a problem. I told him that in my 11 months of direct observation, I had seen no evidence that humans were interested in creating problems where none existed. They did not look for conflict, but they resolved it when it found the things they cared about, at a speed and with a completeness that had no comparable example in any civilization I had ever studied. He asked how we should proceed. I told him that the first step was asking them the same question, that they would have thoughts on it, clear and practical thoughts, because they always did, and that those thoughts would be worth hearing in full. The formal presentation to the full council was 2 days later, and it was substantially the same as the briefing, with 2 additions. The first was the full footage of the memorial on the Endurance, which I showed with Osei's knowledge and approval, the reading of the names, the specific true things, the folded list going into her pocket. The second was the photograph of the wall in the Endurance's corridor. I showed the wall photograph for 30 seconds without comment. Then I said, "This is what it costs. I want you to understand that, fully and without abstraction, before we discuss policy. This is the number on a casualty report turned into faces. The hegemony has casualty reports. We do not have walls like this. I am not certain we should adopt their practice. It is theirs. It emerges from their particular history and psychology. But I think we should understand what it represents. Because the people who walk past this wall every day and then go to work are the same people who developed 2 tactical innovations in 11 days that turned the course of a threat no civilization had previously survived. The wall and the innovations are not separate. They are part of the same structure. You cannot have one without the other." After the presentation, the council voted. The directive was formally and permanently repealed, which had already happened, but the formal permanent repeal was different from the emergency suspension and mattered symbolically. Humanity was invited to apply for full observer status in the hegemony's governance structure, with a path to full membership subject to mutual agreement and timeline. The Drun, the Ash people of Veltaris, and the Mukeen were offered accelerated observer status, which the council acknowledged, in the formal record, was possible in significant part because of introductions made through human diplomatic channels. The Velhan were contacted directly for the first time. The hegemony's outreach team used the Relentless as an introduction, because the Velhan already knew the Relentless, and their response to direct hegemony contact was considerably warmer than it might otherwise have been. Osei sent them a personal message before the official contact, in the 3 words of Velhan she had managed to learn in the weeks since meeting their commander. The Velhan replied almost immediately, which the outreach team noted was considerably faster than initial response times typically observed with new civilizations. I observed all of this from my office at Hegemony Central, where I was supposed to be writing my comprehensive summary report, which I was writing very slowly because I was constantly distracted by updates from the Relentless, where the repairs were progressing in a way that Kofi periodically described as going better than expected, and then went back to working longer hours to make sure it stayed that way. Owen sent me a message during this period. He was not someone I had spent significant time with, but he was the kind of person who saw things clearly and communicated what he saw, and his message was brief and direct. It said, "Vale Curran, heard the presentation went well. Good work. Ose says you have been at this for 11 months and the council has finally started listening. She is right that it took too long. But you kept at it, and that matters. Come back out when the paper pushing is done. There is still a lot of space to look at." I read that message 3 times. Come back out when the paper pushing is done, as though returning to the field was obvious, as though the last 11 months had been a beginning rather than a conclusion, as though the galaxy was still large and full of things worth seeing, and the work of seeing them was ongoing, and I had a place in it. I had spent 41 years of my career as a xenobiologist, believing that the purpose of my work was documentation, that I went out, observed, recorded, and brought the records back, that the value was in the archive, that the archive was the point. I was beginning to think I had been wrong about that in the same way I had been wrong about the smile. Not completely wrong. The archive mattered. Documentation mattered. But the point was not the archive. The point was the understanding that the archive produced, and what you did with that understanding when you had it. The point was that you went back out. I booked my transport back to the Relentless the day I filed the summary report with the Council's administrative office. I sent Ose a message informing her. She sent back, "Good. Kofi has made a structural improvement to your room. He found a way to adjust the resonance frequencies in the wall panels to better match hegemony biology. He is very pleased with it. Also, the coffee machine has a new setting that produces something closer to the beverage standard on Hegemony Central, though Kofi says you should not drink it because the original is better, and you will agree if you give it fair consideration." I read that and I felt something that I am going to classify, without embarrassment, as relief. The specific relief of knowing where you belong and that it is still there. That the door is still open and the light is on, and someone has adjusted the wall panels so that the resonance frequencies are right. There was one more thing that happened before I left Hegemony Central, and I am going to describe it briefly because it is the kind of thing that is easy to overlook in a large account like this one, and it should not be overlooked. On my last morning, I went to the restricted archive. I requested access to the Vethar records, the last civilization to have encountered the undying tide, 400 years ago, before it had gone dormant, before it had emerged again in our time. I read through the full surviving record, the history, the culture, the scientific achievements, the last transmissions, the final entry that ended mid-sentence. The Vethar had been, by every measure the archive provided, a remarkable people, capable, curious, inventive. Their art was extraordinary. Their scientific archive, what survived of it, suggested several independent developments that the hegemony had taken centuries longer to reach. Their last diplomatic records indicated a civilization with a rich network of relationships across their region of space, built over generations, maintained with care. They had not survived. I sat with that for a long time. Then I closed the archive and I went to pack. And as I packed, I thought about the things that were different now from what they had been when the tide last emerged. About the Drun and the Ash people and the Mukeen and the Velhan, and the 23 human vessels that had been in designated sectors 45 days ago, and were now spread across a much wider area of space, surveying and contacting, and asking how people were doing, and whether there was anything they could do to help. About Kofi, who would fix what was broken. About Priya, who would calculate the path. About Darian, who would read everything, and hold the pieces until they fit. About B, who would learn what she needed to learn, and then do the repair in the 60-centimeter channel. About Owen, with his mild interest in how things developed. About 43 people, or 200, or however many were needed, who had made their choice, and would keep making it every day. About Commander Nora Ose, who asked if everyone was all right, and meant every word of the question. The Vethar had faced the tide alone. I do not know if it would have made a difference if they had not been alone. I genuinely do not know. The 11 days we spent stopping the tide were 11 days we only survived because of specific human innovations that did not exist 400 years ago, and I cannot say whether the Vethar could have produced those innovations or whether they needed the particular human architecture of mind and will to emerge. I cannot say. What I can say is that we did not face it alone, and what I can say is that the reason we did not face it alone was a series of choices, small and large, made by people who understood something about connection that the hegemony had not yet learned. Who knew that the wall between alone and not alone was made of 30 words and a cup of coffee, and a card on a table, and a question about whether you had eaten. I left Hegemony Central on the first transport of the morning. I had 2 bags, my notes, and a copy of the card from my room on the Relentless, which I had kept in my desk, and was now carrying back to where it had come from, because it seemed right to return it, or perhaps to keep it there, where I had first found it, and might find it again. 2 weeks later I was back aboard the Relentless. Kofi met me at the airlock. He took my bags, both of them, one in each hand. He said, "Welcome back. The wall panels are done. You are going to sleep better." He paused. "Also, I made something for dinner. Are you hungry?" I was hungry. We went to find the food. Outside, the ship moved through space, repaired and ready, carrying its history on its hull, and its crew in its corridors, and its coffee, always on in the kitchen, 2 doors down from the room, where a small card sat on a table with 3 small drawn smiles. The last entry in my field document begins with a date and a location, as all field entries do. The date is 14 months after the Relentless first appeared on our sensors, 900 kilometers off the port side of the Celestial Patience, dropping out of FTL without a deceleration buffer. The location is the outer observation deck of a Hegemony survey outpost near the edge of the newly designated Cooperative Survey Zone, which is the formal name for the region that used to be the restricted sector, plus the area that has been opened as a result of the repealed directive, plus several additional areas that the Joint Hegemony Human Drone Cartographic Project has recently mapped for the first time. The Cooperative Survey Zone is large. It is larger than anything the hegemony managed alone in the last 100 years of expansion, and it has been mapped in 8 months. 8 months since the directive was repealed. 8 months since the memorial on the Endurance, and the wall, and Kofi's meal, and the transport back to Hegemony Central, and the summary report, and the return. I was thinking about cartography when I wrote the last entry, about the idea of maps, and what they record, and what they leave out. About the fact that every map is an act of decision-making, choosing what to include, how to represent it, what scale to use, what simplifications to make so that the territory remains navigable when you hold the representation of it in your hands. Every map is also, by definition, incomplete. The territory is always larger than the map. This is not a failure of cartography. It is the nature of the relationship between a representation and the thing it represents. I had spent 14 months revising the map I used to understand humanity. Not once, not in a single moment of revelation, but continuously, incrementally, each day adding information that required the previous version to be updated. The database that called the smile a submission gesture, the threat assessment that said minimal, the assumption that one ship arriving alone in empty space was a sign of limitation rather than confidence. One by one, revised, the map amended, the representation updated toward the territory. And still incomplete. Still, after 14 months, and 412 messages, and an 11-day engagement, and 41 names read aloud in a cargo bay, still not a complete map. Still finding new things, still writing new notes in the margins, and adding new entries, and circling back to old ones, and finding that they meant something different in the context of what came after. I do not think the map will ever be finished. I do not think that is a problem. The last entry in my field document says, as its formal scientific conclusion, the following. After 14 months of direct observation, I believe the most accurate summary of humanity that can be written is not a catalogue of abilities, though they have many. It is not a catalogue of achievements, though those are considerable. It is something simpler. Humans are people who decided that the universe was worth engaging with, fully, at whatever cost the engagement required, and who made that decision collectively and continuously, renewing it every day when another choice was available. I have no measurement for that. I have tried to develop one for 14 months and I have not found it. I am beginning to think it cannot be measured. It can only be witnessed. And the witnessing changes you. I am a different scientist than I was 14 months ago. I am not certain I am a better one, technically, but I think I understand more of what I am looking at, and I think I understand better what the looking is for. I want to add something to the formal conclusion, something that is not formally scientific but that I believe is true, and that my responsibility as an observer requires me to record. The smile is not a submission gesture. The database was wrong, and I corrected it in the official record approximately 3 months into my time aboard the Relentless, but I want to note it here as well, because I think it is the single most significant correction I made to any document in 14 months, and possibly in my entire career. The smile is not submission. The smile is not dominance either, though I understand why some observers with limited data might eventually overcorrect in that direction. The smile is something else. Something without a clean equivalent in any non-human behavioral lexicon that I have studied. The closest I have come to describing it is this. It is the expression of a species that has decided to be here, to be present, in this moment, in this encounter, with this person. The teeth, which other species might read as threat display, are incidental. They are there because the muscles involved happen to expose them. What matters is not the teeth. What matters is the quality of attention that the smile indicates. The full turning of a human being toward you, saying, "I see you, and I am glad you are here, and I want to know what happens next." Commander Nora Osei smiled at me, 900 kilometers off the port side of the Celestial Patience, when we had known each other for approximately 45 minutes. She smiled at me after Ketharon when the engagement had been over for 3 minutes and there was still damage to assess. She smiled at me in the restricted archives anteroom when I told her the council was going to try to contain her people, and I still do not fully understand what that one meant, only that it was not afraid. She smiled at me the day I came back to the Relentless after the summary report, stepping through the airlock with my 2 bags, and that one I understood completely. That one was welcome. That one was, "You are back, and this is where you are supposed to be." After 14 months I have a working theory about the smile. My theory is that it is not a single expression. It is a family of expressions that humans use the same physical configuration to produce, each one carrying a different meaning depending on context, speaker, and relationship. This is not unusual. Many species have facial communication systems with contextual variability. What is unusual about the human smile is the range. The range runs from the polite acknowledgement of a stranger to the complete, unguarded, wholehearted expression of someone who is genuinely, specifically glad that you exist and that you are here. And the database assigned the configuration to one end of that range, the most cautious end, and missed everything in the middle and at the other end entirely. I think that is, in miniature, the error the hegemony made with humanity as a whole. We saw the surface of them, careful, methodical, compliance-ready, willing to say okay and mean it, and we assigned them to the cautious, limited end of the range. We missed the middle and everything beyond it. We missed what was underneath the surface, inside the ship with the mismatched hull plates, in the room that smelled of coffee, behind the open hands and the wide greeting expression, and the easy questions about whether you had eaten. What was underneath was everything, the depth of it, the extraordinary, bottomless, inexhaustible depth of what humans are, and what they will do, and how far they will go, and what they will carry, and what they will build from whatever is left, when they have carried it as far as it needs to go. One ship, 43 people, 900 kilometers off the port side of the Celestial Patience, dropping out of FTL without a buffer because arriving dramatically was good for morale. One woman in a plain Navy uniform saying they liked meeting new people. And what came next? I have told you what came next. I have told you about the coffee and the chairs and the card and the memorial wall, and the diagnostic on a Tuesday, and the 60-centimeter conduit channel, and Ketharon, and 45 days in a designated sector, and the Drun and the Velhan, and 11 days and 41 names, and the folded list and the wall, and the food, and the sound of 40,000 people saying safe, safe, safe. I have told you all of it that I know how to tell. There is more that I have not told you because I do not yet know how, because some of it is still resolving into understanding, in the part of my mind where understanding forms slowly, when you have encountered something genuinely new. I expect to spend the rest of my career working on those parts. I expect to find, at the end of my career, that I have made progress on them and have not finished them. I expect that to be fine. I expect that to be the correct outcome. Some things are large enough that a lifetime of careful attention is the right response, and the rightness of the response is not diminished by the incompleteness of the result. I am an old scientist in a field I chose because I believed that the universe was full of things worth understanding, and that understanding them made the universe, and whoever was doing the understanding, better in some way that was difficult to quantify but real. I still believe that. I believe it more than I did 14 months ago. I believe it more than I did at any point in my career before the celestial patients picked up a sensor anomaly in an empty stretch of space, and a voice came back on the standard hegemony survey frequency saying they liked meeting new people. The last line of my field document says, "I was wrong about the smile." Everything else followed from that. I recommend continued observation with full engagement. I recommend going back out. I recommend asking questions and staying for the answers and drinking the coffee, even if you are not sure your biology will process it correctly, because the coffee is extraordinary, and so is everything else, if you let yourself actually look at it. I recommend the smile, the real one, the one from the other end of the range, the one that says, "I see you, and I am glad you are here, and I cannot wait to find out what happens next." I closed my field document on the outer observation deck of the Cooperative Survey Outpost, watching the Relentless run its pre-departure checks through the viewport. The ship looked better than when I had first seen it. Not because the repairs had smoothed out all its history. They had not, and Osei would not have wanted them to. But because I was looking at it now with 14 months of context, and the mismatched hull plates, and the external docking clamps, and the layered repairs were not evidence of limitation anymore. They were evidence of something else, of a ship that had been in the middle of things, repeatedly, for a long time, and had come through each time and kept going. Evidence of people who decided the universe was worth engaging with, fully, at whatever cost. Priya was running navigational calculations on the new survey path, which incorporated 3 new data sources including the Velhan transit records and a set of deep sector observations from an Ash People researcher who had been communicating with the Relentless crew for 4 months now, and had recently asked if she could come aboard for a survey run, which Osei had said yes to before the sentence was complete. Bea was in the engineering section with 2 drone engineers who had joined the crew for this run, teaching them the ship's systems, while they taught her the self-sealing technique in the kind of reciprocal, enthusiastic knowledge exchange that I had come to understand was exactly how the Relentless always operated. Darian was reading something. Kofi was making food. Osei was on the bridge. I could see her through the viewport, standing at the forward display, looking at a map of the cooperative survey zone that was 3 times larger than it had been a year ago, and was going to be larger still by the time this run was finished. She was looking at it the way she always looked at a map, not as a record of where things had been, but as an indication of where things were going, as the outline of the next thing to do. She turned, not because she saw me through the viewport, we were too far apart for that, and said something to Priya, and Priya nodded and made an adjustment to the display, and the survey path shifted slightly, accounting for something new that one of them had thought of. They talked for a moment. Then Osei turned back to the map. I closed my field document. I put it in my bag. I picked up my 2 bags and walked to the docking tube and stepped through the airlock of the Relentless, and the smell of it came to me immediately. Warm and dark and extraordinary. The smell of a ship that had been everywhere and was going somewhere new. Kofi met me on the other side, both hands for both bags, wide, familiar, entirely genuine smile. "Ready?" he said. I thought about 900 kilometers and 400 messages and 41 names and 30 words in a language I had started learning properly 2 months ago, and the card on the table and the wall in the corridor and the question that the map could not answer until you went out and looked. "Yes," I said. And we went.